Those 6 words echoed through the first-class cabin of Coastal Airways Flight 447 like a slap across the face. They saw the hoodie. They saw the sneakers. They saw her brown skin. What they didn't see was the woman who had just signed the largest hostile takeover in aviation history. Security officers dragged Maya Rodriguez from seat 1A while entitled passengers smirked and flight attendants looked the other way. They thought they were removing a non-compliant passenger who didn't belong in first class. They had no idea they were actively destroying their own company. It took them 12 minutes to remove her from that plane. It took her 12 seconds to destroy their airline forever. This isn't just a story about bad customer service. This is financial warfare. This is a masterclass in how one woman turned a moment of humiliation into a $6 billion lesson in respect. This is what happens when they mistake the owner of the building for someone who doesn't belong inside it. The fluorescent lights of LaGuardia Airport's private terminal cast harsh shadows across the marble floor at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October. Storm clouds had grounded flights for hours, creating a powder keg of frustrated passengers and overwhelmed staff. But for Maya Rodriguez, exhausted after 72 hours of negotiations in Boston, the weather delay was just another obstacle between her and home. She had no idea that in the next hour she would become the most powerful woman those people had ever tried to humiliate. She had no idea that their bias would cost them everything. Because when you bet against someone, you better make sure they don't own the casino. Before we dive into this story of justice served ice cold, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been judged by your appearance before people knew who you really were? Have you ever been told you don't belong somewhere because of how you look? If you're nodding right now, this story is for you. If you believe everyone deserves respect, regardless of their skin color, their clothes, or their background, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what happens next will change how airlines treat passengers forever. And if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed, stay with me, because Maya Rodriguez is about to show the world what quiet power looks like when it finally decides to speak. The woman walking through LaGuardia's private terminal looked like a tired graduate student heading home after finals. Her Brunello Cucinelli cashmere hoodie was wrinkled from 3 days of wear. Her vintage Air Jordan sneakers had seen better years. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup, no jewelry visible except for the watch she wore face down against her wrist. To the untrained eye, Maya Rodriguez looked like someone who might be flying on miles. Maybe someone who had gotten lucky with an upgrade. She moved with quiet confidence through the nearly empty terminal, pulling a modest black carry-on behind her. She approached Gate A7 where Coastal Airways Flight 447 to Los Angeles was preparing for boarding. The gate agent glanced up from her screen, then quickly looked back down. First-class passengers didn't usually look like this. Maya pulled out her phone and checked her boarding pass one more time. Seat 1A. The suite she had specifically requested for its privacy and ability to recline fully flat. After the deal she had just closed in Boston, she needed sleep more than anything else in the world. Behind her, the automatic doors of the terminal slid open with a whisper. Preston Whitmore strode through like he owned the place, his voice echoing across the terminal as he barked into his AirPods about quarterly projections and market positions. His bespoke navy suit was perfectly tailored. His Italian leather briefcase gleamed under the lights, and his platinum frequent flyer card caught the light as he waved it like a weapon. The same gate agent who had barely acknowledged Maya's presence transformed completely when she saw Preston approaching. Her spine straightened. Her smile appeared. Her voice took on a tone of reverence typically reserved for visiting royalty. And in that moment, the stage was set for a collision that would reshape an entire industry. What you're about to witness isn't just revenge. It's something far more powerful and far more permanent. This is the story of a woman who understood that true power doesn't scream, doesn't threaten, and doesn't make scenes in public. True power waits. True power plans. And when the time is right, true power simply acts. Maya Rodriguez spent her entire career building something that couldn't be taken away by someone's bias or assumptions. She built wealth. She built influence. She built a position so strong that when people tried to diminish her, she could do more than fight back. She could purchase their entire world and rewrite the rules. You're going to see racism. You're going to see privilege. You're going to see the kind of casual cruelty that happens every day when people think no one important is watching. But you're also going to see what happens when the person they're trying to humiliate turns out to be the most important person in the room. And by the end of this story, you're going to understand why the most dangerous person to underestimate isn't the one who shouts the loudest or throws the biggest tantrum. It's the one who stays calm, takes notes, and owns the company that signs your paycheck. Maya Elena Rodriguez had been building her empire for 23 years, one calculated acquisition at a time. As the founder and CEO of Titan Capital Management, she controlled $12 billion in assets, specializing in distressed companies that others had written off as hopeless. She was 45 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, with dark hair that she kept professionally styled when she was in business mode, but tonight hung loose around her shoulders. Her grandmother's wedding ring was the only jewelry she wore consistently, a simple gold band that reminded her where she came from. Tonight she wore a $2,000 Brunello Cucinelli cashmere hoodie in charcoal gray, not because she was trying to look casual, but because she had been living in boardrooms for 3 straight days and comfort had become more important than appearances. Her jeans were dark wash denim that cost more than most people's monthly car payments, though you'd never know it to look at them. On her feet were vintage Air Jordan 1s in black and red shoes she'd bought in college and had resold 3 times because they reminded her of the girl who used to dream about having enough money to buy anything she wanted. Now she had enough money to buy entire companies, but she still wore the same shoes. The Patek Philippe Nautilus with a Tiffany blue dial on her left wrist was worth more than most people's houses, but she wore it face down, so the watch face rested against her pulse. Old habit from her early days in finance, when showing wealth could get you excluded from the real conversations. Maya had learned a long time ago that people's assumptions about her could be either a weapon or a shield, depending on how she chose to use them. Tonight, she just wanted to get home. She was returning from Boston, where she had spent the last 72 hours in a windowless conference room finalizing the acquisition of Monroe Industries, a aerospace parts manufacturer that had been bleeding money for 2 years. The company's board had been desperate enough to accept her offer of $6 billion a price that everyone in the room thought was too generous. What they didn't realize was that Maya never made generous offers. She made strategic ones. Monroe Industries manufactured critical engine components, hydraulic systems, and safety equipment for commercial aircraft. Their client list read like a who's who of the aviation industry: American Delta, United Southwest, and Coastal Airways. Especially Coastal Airways. Maya had done her research. Coastal Airways relied on Monroe Industries for 63% of their critical replacement parts. They had an exclusive contract that gave them preferential pricing and priority delivery, a contract that had kept Coastal profitable even when other airlines struggled. That contract was about to become Maya's weapon of choice. Maya Rodriguez was 16 years old when she learned that money talks, but wealth screams. Her family was driving back to Los Angeles from a weekend in San Diego, celebrating her father's promotion to regional sales manager for a medical supply company. It was the first vacation they had taken in 3 years, and her parents had saved for months to afford 2 nights at a decent hotel. The Ocean View Resort in La Jolla had confirmed their reservation 3 times. Maya's mother had called twice to verify the room type and amenities. Her father had pre-authorized his credit card to avoid any issues at check-in. But when the Rodriguez family walked through the marble lobby, the desk clerk took one look at Maya's father's work clothes and her mother's discount store dress and made an assumption. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any availability tonight," the manager said without checking his computer. He was a thin, pale man in his 50s, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the Holiday Inn down the highway." Maya's father pulled out the confirmation number, the printed reservation, and his credit card. "We have a reservation. Room 312. Rodriguez family." The manager glanced at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. "These systems malfunction sometimes. Computers can be booked that don't actually exist. Your kind doesn't usually stay in places like this. Are you sure you can afford it?" "Your kind." Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach. Around them, white families checked in without question. Their reservations were honored. Their credit cards were accepted. Their presence was welcomed. But her family, despite having a confirmed reservation and money in the bank, was being turned away. Her father didn't argue. He didn't make a scene. He calmly pulled out his wallet and counted out $750 in cash. This should cover the entire stay plus incidentals. The manager's expression changed when he saw the money. Cash was harder to dismiss than a credit card. Cash was proof. They got their room. But Maya never forgot the lesson. Money gave you access, but only if people believed you had the right to spend it. Respect wasn't earned through achievement or character. It was purchased through the visible symbols of wealth that people recognized and feared. That night, 16-year-old Maya Rodriguez made herself a promise. She would never again be in a position where someone could question whether she belonged somewhere because of how she looked. She would become so wealthy, so powerful, so undeniably successful that the question would never arise again. And if it did, she would have the resources to make sure the person asking regretted it for the rest of their career. 29 years later, sitting in seat 1A of a flight where she was about to be humiliated for the same reason her family had been turned away from that hotel, Maya was about to keep that promise in spectacular fashion. The Monroe Industries acquisition had been Maya's primary focus for 8 months. The company was hemorrhaging money, but their intellectual property and manufacturing capabilities were worth far more than their current market value. More importantly, their client relationships were worth their weight in platinum. Maya had flown to Boston on Sunday morning with a team of lawyers, accountants, and industry specialists. The negotiations had been brutal. Monroe's board was divided between members who wanted to accept Maya's offer and others who believed they could find a better deal elsewhere. By Tuesday afternoon, Maya was running on 4 hours of sleep and endless cups of coffee. She had been wearing the same hoodie for 3 days, changing only her jeans and undergarments each morning. Her usual business attire was hanging in her hotel room, but she hadn't had time to change before rushing to catch the last flight to Los Angeles. The final breakthrough had come at 6 p.m., when Monroe's largest creditor had threatened to call in their loans if the deal wasn't finalized by midnight. Maya had used the pressure to her advantage, holding firm on her original offer while watching the board members realize they had no other options. At 10:47 p.m., exactly 13 minutes before her flight was scheduled to board, Maya had signed the final documents that made her the majority owner of Monroe Industries. The acquisition gave Titan Capital Management control over the largest independent aerospace parts manufacturer in the United States. It also gave Maya leverage over every airline that depended on Monroe's products to keep their planes in the air. Her phone had been buzzing constantly during the cab ride to the airport. Text messages from her CFO about market reactions, emails from industry analysts wanting comments, calls from reporters who had somehow gotten wind of the deal. Maya had ignored them all. She would deal with the media coverage tomorrow. Tonight, she just wanted to get home to her house in Malibu, pour herself a glass of wine, and sleep for 12 hours. She had no idea that she was about to become involved in a situation that would require every bit of power and influence she had spent her career building. But she was about to learn that all the money in the world couldn't protect you from other people's assumptions. It could only help you respond to them in ways that changed the world. Preston Whitmore III was everything that was wrong with inherited wealth and unearned confidence, rolled into a 6'2" package of Ivy League arrogance and old money entitlement. At 45, he managed a hedge fund with his name on the door that had been started with his grandfather's railroad fortune and sustained by his family's connections rather than his actual talent for investment. He had attended Phillips Exeter Academy, Yale University, and Harvard Business School, not because of his grades, but because 3 generations of Whitmores had attended before him. His bespoke navy suit was tailored by a shop on Savile Row in London that had been dressing his family for 60 years. His Italian leather briefcase contained documents from a deal he had just failed to close in Boston, a failure he was already spinning in his mind as someone else's fault. Preston flew first class on every airline and held platinum status with 4 different carriers. He treated flight attendants like servants, gate agents like obstacles, and fellow passengers like annoyances to be tolerated. He had never been denied anything in his life that his family's name or money couldn't purchase. He was returning from the same acquisition meeting that Maya had won. Preston's firm had been trying to purchase Monroe Industries for 6 months, seeing it as an opportunity to break the company apart and sell the pieces for a quick profit. He had been confident of success until a mysterious competitor had appeared with a superior offer. Preston had no idea that the woman in the hoodie sitting across from him at the gate was the same person who had just destroyed his deal and cost his investors $200 million in projected profits. Carmen Valdez was 32 years old and had been working for Coastal Airways for 8 years, long enough to recognize trouble when she saw it developing in her cabin. She had a nursing degree from UCLA that she had never used professionally because the money in commercial aviation was better than hospital work, at least for someone without connections in the medical field. Her plan was to save enough money to pay off her student loans and then transition to a career where she could help people instead of serving drinks at 30,000 feet. Carmen was 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark hair that she kept pulled back in the tight bun required by company regulations. She had been born in East Los Angeles to parents who had immigrated from Mexico before she was born, and she spoke Spanish as fluently as English. She was smart enough to recognize bias when she saw it, and experienced enough to know that challenging authority could cost her job. But she was also moral enough to feel sick when she watched discrimination happen in front of her without speaking up. Tonight, Carmen was working as the senior flight attendant on Flight 447, responsible for first-class service and conflict resolution. She had already noticed the tension developing between Preston and Maya, and her instincts were telling her that the situation was about to get much worse. Jennifer Walsh was 48 years old and had been with Coastal Airways for 15 years, long enough to have developed strong opinions about who belonged in first class and who didn't. She lived in a suburban neighborhood outside Denver, where she had never had a meaningful conversation with a person of color, and her assumptions about people were based primarily on television and social media rather than actual experience. Jennifer considered herself a rule follower and a problem solver, but her definition of problems was heavily influenced by unconscious bias that she had never been forced to examine. She genuinely believed that she treated all passengers fairly, even as she consistently applied different standards based on appearance and assumptions about economic status. She was scheduled to retire in 2 years with a full pension, and she had no intention of doing anything that might jeopardize her benefits. In her mind, avoiding conflict meant supporting the passengers who seemed most likely to complain to management. Maria Santos, 28, was a travel blogger from Phoenix who specialized in documenting discrimination in the hospitality industry. She had built a following of 50,000 subscribers by exposing hotels, restaurants, and airlines that treated customers differently based on race or apparent economic status. David Kim, 35, was a tech executive from San Francisco who had built his career by avoiding controversy and keeping his head down. He had experienced his share of bias in the corporate world, but had learned to address it quietly rather than making public scenes. Rebecca Thompson, 67, was a retired elementary school teacher from Minneapolis who was slowly awakening to the reality of racism that she had been privileged enough to ignore for most of her life. James Rodriguez, 42, was an off-duty pilot for a competing airline who understood exactly how company policies were supposed to work and could recognize when they were being misapplied. Each of these passengers was about to become a witness to something that would change their understanding of power justice and the responsibility that comes with watching injustice unfold. The gate area for Coastal Airways Flight 447 was nearly empty at 11:42 p.m. Storm clouds had delayed the flight by 3 hours, and most passengers had found quiet corners where they could doze or work while waiting for the weather to clear. Maya approached the boarding desk where Jennifer Walsh was preparing passenger manifests and checking documentation for the delayed departure. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows that made everyone look tired and wary. "Good evening," Maya said quietly, presenting her boarding pass. "I believe we're ready to start boarding." Jennifer glanced at the boarding pass, then at Maya, then back at the boarding pass. Her eyes lingered on the first-class designation, then traveled up and down Maya's casual attire. The hoodie, the sneakers, the complete absence of the luxury accessories that Jennifer associated with first-class passengers. Jennifer said, her voice taking on the artificially sweet tone that service workers use when they're about to ask uncomfortable questions. "Sometimes our mobile boarding passes have technical glitches, especially with seat upgrades. Could I see a second form of ID to verify your identity?" Maya's internal alarm system activated immediately. She had experienced this dance before. The polite skepticism, the request for additional verification that was never asked of white passengers. The assumption that her presence in first class must be the result of some kind of error. "Of course," Maya said, calmly pulling out her driver's license. The name on the license matched the boarding pass exactly. "Is there something specific you need to verify?" Jennifer studied the documents with more attention than they deserved, as if Maya's California driver's license might contain some hidden clue that would explain how someone dressed like a college student could afford a seat that cost $4,000. "I'm sorry," Jennifer said, not sounding sorry at all. "It's just that we've had some issues with fraudulent bookings lately, and I want to make sure everything is legitimate before we board." The word legitimate hung in the air like smoke. Maya felt the familiar heat rising in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced in boardrooms when men questioned her expertise in restaurants, when servers assumed she couldn't afford the wine list in retail stores where security followed her more closely than other customers. But Maya had learned long ago that anger was a luxury she couldn't afford in situations like this. Anger made people dismiss you as emotional. Anger gave them permission to treat you like a problem instead of a person. So Maya smiled. It wasn't a warm smile or a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who was taking mental notes and would remember this conversation long after Jennifer had forgotten it. "I understand your concern about fraud," Maya said, her voice dropping into the register she used during hostile business negotiations. "I paid cash for this ticket 2 weeks ago. The confirmation number is in your system. My identification matches the reservation exactly. Is there anything else you need to verify my legitimacy?" The emphasis she placed on the last word made it clear that she had caught Jennifer's coded language and was reflecting it back to her. Jennifer's cheeks flushed slightly as she realized that her bias had been recognized and called out, but she was too committed to her suspicion to back down gracefully. "I'm just following standard procedures," Jennifer said defensively. "I treat all passengers the same way." "Do you?" Maya asked quietly. "Because I've been watching you for the last 10 minutes and you didn't ask for additional identification from any of the other first-class passengers who checked in before me." Before Jennifer could respond, the automatic doors of the gate area burst open and Preston Whitmore strode through like he was making an entrance on a stage. His voice echoed across the nearly empty space as he spoke loudly into his AirPods about quarterly projections and market manipulation strategies. I don't care what the SEC filing says, Preston barked into his phone. Tell Morrison to liquidate the position before the announcement goes public. We'll make more on the short than we'll lose on the original investment. He approached the boarding desk with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned about his right to be anywhere. His platinum status card was already in his hand before he reached Jennifer's station. The transformation in Jennifer's demeanor was immediate and complete. Her spine straightened. Her professional smile appeared. Her voice took on a tone of deference that bordered on reverence. "Mr. Whitmore," Jennifer exclaimed with genuine enthusiasm. "Welcome back to Coastal Airways. I see you're in 1B tonight. We have your usual scotch ready, and the chef prepared your preferred dinner selection." Preston barely acknowledged her greeting. He was still on his phone, still talking about financial instruments and market positions that he assumed no one else in the gate area would understand. "Yeah, hold on," he said into his phone, then looked at Jennifer with the expression of someone addressing hired help. "Is the cabin ready? I need to get some work done before takeoff." "Of course, sir. We'll begin boarding immediately." Maya watched this exchange with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a fascinating specimen. She had seen this dynamic countless times in her career. The automatic deference given to white men with money. The assumption that their presence in elite spaces was natural and unquestionable. Preston ended his phone call and finally noticed Maya standing at the boarding desk. His eyes traveled from her sneakers to her hoodie to her face, and his expression shifted into the look of mild annoyance that people like Preston reserved for people like Maya, who had somehow ended up in spaces where they didn't belong. "Are we boarding first class now?" he asked Jennifer, deliberately positioning himself so that Maya would have to step aside to continue her conversation with the gate agent. "Yes, sir." "Right away," Jennifer replied. "Let me just finish processing this situation, and we'll get you on board immediately." Preston glanced at Maya dismissively. "Staff deadheading to LAX." He asked Jennifer as if Maya wasn't standing right there. "I thought they usually put crew members in the back." Maya felt the familiar tightening in her chest that always preceded moments when she had to decide how much of herself to reveal. She could end this conversation right now. She could pull out her titanium American Express card, or her Titan Capital business card, or any of a dozen other indicators of her wealth and status. But she was tired, and she wanted to see how far these people would take their assumptions before reality forced them to confront the truth. "I'm not airline staff," Maya said quietly. "I'm a passenger, seat 1A. Preston looked at her again this time with open skepticism. 1A. "That's interesting. I specifically requested 1A when I booked, but they told me it was already taken." He turned to Jennifer with the expression of someone who expected service problems to be solved immediately. "Can we check the seating chart? I think there might be some confusion here." And with those words, Preston Whitmore had just opened the door to the most expensive mistake of his life. Jennifer's fingers flew across her computer keyboard as she pulled up the seating chart for Flight 447. Maya stood quietly to the side, watching the gate agent's face as the reality of the reservation became clear. "Mr. Whitmore," Jennifer said carefully, "it shows that seat 1A was booked 14 days ago and paid for in full. You're confirmed in seat 1B, which is also a premium suite with identical amenities." Preston's jaw tightened. He was accustomed to getting whatever he wanted through a combination of charm, intimidation, and the implicit threat of taking his business elsewhere. The concept of being told that something wasn't available to him was foreign and unwelcome. "I fly Coastal Airways 40 weeks a year," Preston said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm a platinum key holder with over 2 million miles. Surely we can work something out here." Maya watched this negotiation with growing amusement. Preston was essentially arguing that his loyalty to the airline should override her legal right to the seat she had purchased. It was the kind of entitled thinking that she had encountered throughout her career, the assumption that status and connections could trump contracts and fairness. I understand your frustration, Mr. Whitmore, Jennifer said diplomatically. But the passenger in 1A has a confirmed reservation and valid boarding pass. Company policy doesn't allow us to reassign confirmed seats without passenger consent. Preston turned to Maya with the expression of someone who was about to make an offer that no reasonable person could refuse. Look, he said, his tone suggesting that he was being magnanimous rather than presumptuous. I don't know what kind of upgrade situation you have going on here, but I really need the space in 1A for work purposes. I'm closing a major deal tomorrow morning that could affect hundreds of jobs. Maya tilted her head, slightly genuinely curious about where this conversation was heading. What kind of deal? Aerospace manufacturing, Preston said with the confidence of someone who assumed he was the most important person in any conversation about business. Complex financial instruments, private equity, corporate restructuring, probably not something you'd be familiar with. Maya's smile grew a fraction wider. Try me. Preston studied her face for a moment, as if trying to determine whether she was genuinely interested or just making polite conversation. He seemed to conclude that she was probably a graduate student or junior employee who might be impressed by his business acumen. My firm has been working on the acquisition of a distressed aerospace parts manufacturer, he said with the tone of someone explaining advanced concepts to a child. Monroe Industries. Maybe you've heard of them. They supply components to most major airlines. Maya's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. Jennifer, who had been watching this exchange with growing discomfort, failed to notice the change in atmosphere. That sounds fascinating, Maya said quietly. How did that acquisition work out for you? Preston's confidence faltered slightly. Well, there were some complications. Another buyer came in at the last minute with a superior offer. Corporate raiders with more money than sense. But that's the nature of the business. Indeed it is, Maya agreed. So, your deal fell through. These things happen, Preston said dismissively, his ego apparently unable to admit direct failure. But I've got 3 other deals in the pipeline that are worth twice as much. You have to think big picture in this business. Maya nodded thoughtfully. Think big picture. That's excellent advice. Preston took her response as encouragement to continue. Which is why I really need the privacy and workspace that 1A provides. I'll be making calls throughout the flight to London and Hong Kong, coordinating with international partners. The extra space is essential for this level of business. He turned back to Jennifer with renewed confidence. Surely we can upgrade this young lady to business class. I'll personally cover any difference in fare. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. He had decided that Maya was someone who could be bought off with a modest gesture, someone whose needs were less important than his own because his business was obviously more significant than whatever had brought her to Los Angeles. That's very generous, Maya said before Jennifer could respond. But I specifically booked 1A for the same reason you wanted. Privacy and space to work. Preston's expression hardened. The polite negotiation phase was apparently over. Work, he said with barely concealed skepticism. What kind of work do you do that requires first-class accommodations? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maya could feel Jennifer's eyes on her, waiting for an answer that would determine whose side the gate agent would take in this dispute. Maya had reached another decision point. She could continue to let these people reveal their biases, or she could end this charade with a simple explanation of who she was and what she did for a living. She chose to let them dig their hole a little deeper. I work in finance, Maya said simply. Preston's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Finance is a broad category. Are you talking about bank telling, bookkeeping, administrative support? Each suggestion was more insulting than the last, and Maya realized that Preston wasn't just making assumptions about her economic status. He was making assumptions about her intelligence, her education, and her right to occupy the same professional space that he considered his natural domain. Private equity, Maya said quietly. Preston's expression shifted from dismissal to skepticism to something approaching annoyance. Private equity. Which firm? Maya smiled. Titan Capital Management. Preston stared at her for a long moment. The name was obviously familiar to him, but he was struggling to process the information in a way that made sense with his assumptions about who Maya was and where she belonged. "You work for Titan Capital," he said finally. "Not exactly," Maya replied. "I own it." The silence that followed was profound enough to be measured in geological time. Jennifer Walsh felt the conversation spiraling beyond her ability to control it. The professional tension between Preston and Maya had escalated from a simple seating dispute into something that felt like a corporate boardroom confrontation, and she was completely out of her depth. "Perhaps I should call the captain," Jennifer said nervously. "He might be able to help resolve this situation." "That won't be necessary," Maya said calmly. "Mr. Whitmore and I are just having a discussion about business. He was telling me about his failed acquisition of Monroe Industries." Preston's face flushed red. Maya's casual reference to his failed deal was like a knife between his ribs, precise and devastating. She had managed to expose his professional inadequacy while maintaining the appearance of polite conversation. "Failed is a strong word," Preston said through gritted teeth. "Sometimes superior offers come from people with more money than sense. Corporate raiders who overpay for assets they don't understand." Maya nodded sympathetically. "That must be frustrating. Especially when you've spent months preparing a proposal only to have someone sweep in at the last minute with better terms." "Exactly," Preston said, momentarily grateful for what seemed like understanding. "These people have no idea what they're buying. They'll probably run the company into the ground within 2 years. Or Maya said thoughtfully, they might have a strategic vision that your firm wasn't able to see." Preston's gratitude evaporated instantly. Strategic vision. "Lady, I've been doing leveraged buyouts since before you learned what a stock market was. I know value when I see it." Maya's smile never wavered. "I'm sure you do." Jennifer decided that the conversation had gone on long enough. Whatever corporate drama was playing out in front of her, she had a flight to board and passengers to manage. "Excuse me," she interrupted. "I really need to get this flight moving. We're already 3 hours behind schedule." She turned to Maya with the expression of someone who had made a decision about whose side she was going to take. "Ma'am, I understand that you have a confirmed reservation for 1A. But Mr. Whitmore is a platinum key holder with significant status in our frequent flyer program. Would you be willing to consider a voluntary change to seat 2A? It's also a first-class suite, and we'd be happy to provide compensation for the inconvenience." Maya studied Jennifer's face with the same attention she might give to a balance sheet that didn't quite add up. The gate agent had just revealed her bias in the most transparent way possible. When forced to choose between a white man with visible status markers and a black woman without them, Jennifer had made the choice that countless service industry workers made every day. "No," Maya said simply. "I won't be moving." Preston stepped forward, his patience finally exhausted. "Look, I don't know what kind of diversity upgrade or staff travel situation you've got going on here, but I pay full fare for first-class seats. I'm not sitting in 1B so you can take pictures for your social media." The casual racism in his comment was breathtaking. Preston had just assumed that Maya's presence in first class must be the result of some kind of affirmative action program or employee benefit, rather than her ability to pay for the seat herself. Maya felt the familiar cold calculation settling over her mind, the same mental state that had allowed her to build a billion-dollar company by turning other people's mistakes into her advantages. Jennifer, Maya said quietly, "I'd like you to note the time and document this conversation. Mr. Whitmore just suggested that my presence in first class must be the result of a diversity program rather than my ability to pay for the seat. I'd like that comment included in any incident report you file. Jennifer's eyes widened. She realized that Maya was creating a paper trail, and that meant this situation was about to become much more serious than a simple seating dispute. Ma'am, I'm sure Mr. Whitmore didn't mean anything inappropriate by his comment. Perhaps we could all take a step back and find a solution that works for everyone. But Preston was beyond the reach of diplomatic solutions. Maya's request for documentation had triggered his fight-or-flight response, and Preston had never learned how to retreat gracefully from a confrontation. "You want to document something," he said, his voice rising loud enough to attract attention from other passengers in the gate area. "Document this: I spend over $100,000 a year flying Coastal Airways. I've been a loyal customer for 15 years, and now I'm being asked to give up my seat preference so that some affirmative action case can take pictures for Instagram." Maya pulled out her phone and began recording. "Please continue," she said calmly. "I want to make sure I capture your thoughts accurately." The sight of the camera seemed to snap Preston back to some level of awareness about what he was saying and who might eventually see it, but it was too late to take back the words that had already been spoken. Jennifer looked around the gate area and noticed that other passengers were starting to pay attention to the confrontation. Maria Santos had her phone out and appeared to be recording. David Kim was watching with obvious discomfort. Rebecca Thompson looked horrified. "I think we need to get the captain involved," Jennifer said desperately. "This situation requires management attention." Maya slipped her phone back into her pocket and smiled. "I think that's an excellent idea. Let's get your captain down here so we can discuss company policies about passenger treatment and seating assignments." She paused for a moment, looking directly at Preston. "And while we're waiting for him, Mr. Whitmore, you might want to call your office and tell them that Titan Capital Management was the firm that outbid you for Monroe Industries. I'd hate for you to find out in tomorrow's financial press." Preston stared at her with growing horror as the implications of what she had just said began to sink in. Jennifer looked back and forth between them, completely lost. And in that moment, both Preston and Jennifer realized that they had made the kind of mistake that people spend the rest of their careers trying to live down. Captain James Rodriguez emerged from the boarding tunnel with the weary expression of a man who had been flying commercial aircraft for 22 years and had seen every possible variation of passenger conflict. He was a compact man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of calm demeanor that came from handling emergencies at 30,000 feet. "Evening, folks," he said, approaching the gate desk where Jennifer stood looking increasingly desperate. "I understand we have a seating situation that needs some attention." Jennifer quickly explained the dispute, carefully framing it as a conflict between two passengers who both wanted the same seat, rather than acknowledging the racial dynamics that had turned a simple seating chart into a confrontation about privilege and belonging. Captain Rodriguez listened patiently, then looked at Maya and Preston with the expression of someone who was trying to determine which passenger was going to be the bigger problem for his flight crew. "Let me see your boarding passes," he said, diplomatically. Maya handed over her documents without comment. Her boarding pass clearly showed seat 1A purchased 14 days earlier, paid in full. Her identification matched the reservation exactly. Preston's boarding pass showed seat 1B also purchased in advance, also paid in full. "Well," Captain Rodriguez said, after examining both sets of documents, "it seems like we have a straightforward situation here. Ms. Rodriguez has a confirmed reservation for 1A, Mr. Whitmore has a confirmed reservation for 1B. Both seats are first-class suites with identical amenities." Preston's face reddened. "Captain, I've been flying Coastal Airways for 15 years. I'm a platinum key holder with over 2 million miles. I specifically requested 1A when I made this reservation, but I was told it was already taken." "And it was?" Captain Rodriguez replied calmly. "Ms. Rodriguez booked it 2 weeks ago." Preston turned to Maya with barely controlled frustration. Are you seriously not willing to switch seats? 1B is exactly the same as 1A. Same bed, same service, same amenities. Maya looked at him with the expression of someone who was genuinely puzzled by his logic. If the seats are exactly the same, why do you need mine? It was a perfectly reasonable question that exposed the fundamental irrationality of Preston's position. If the seats were truly identical, his insistence on having Maya's seat could only be explained by his belief that he deserved preferential treatment based on his status, rather than the actual terms of the reservations. Preston realized he was trapped by his own argument, and his response revealed more about his character than he probably intended. Because I paid full fare for first-class service, and I expect to get what I paid for, he said, his voice rising. I shouldn't have to negotiate with staff travelers or diversity upgrades who got their seats through some kind of program. Captain Rodriguez's expression hardened. As a Hispanic man who had worked his way up through the aviation industry, he recognized coded racism when he heard it. Mr. Whitmore, he said sharply, Ms. Rodriguez is not a staff traveler or an upgrade passenger. She purchased her seat at the same full fare that you paid for yours. Preston looked back and forth between Maya and Captain Rodriguez, finally realizing that his assumptions about Maya's economic status might be incorrect. But instead of backing down gracefully, he doubled down on his entitlement. Look, I don't care how she got the seat, he said. I need 1A for business reasons. I'll be working throughout the flight, making international calls, coordinating with partners in London and Hong Kong. The privacy and space are essential for the level of business I conduct. Maya decided that Preston had revealed enough of his character for one evening. What kind of business requires international calls during a 5-hour domestic flight? She asked with genuine curiosity. Preston straightened his shoulders and assumed the posture of someone delivering an important announcement. I'm managing a portfolio of distressed assets for institutional investors, complex financial instruments that require constant monitoring and adjustment. Maya nodded thoughtfully. That sounds challenging. Which investments are you currently monitoring? Preston seemed to interpret her question as evidence that she was impressed by his professional importance. Right now, I'm dealing with the fallout from a failed acquisition. My firm spent months preparing to purchase Monroe Industries, an aerospace parts manufacturer, but some corporate raider came in at the last minute and outbid us. Maya's smile became genuinely warm for the first time all evening. How unfortunate. What was your firm planning to do with Monroe Industries if you had acquired it? Preston launched into what was clearly a rehearsed explanation of his investment strategy. Break it up. Sell the profitable divisions, liquidate the underperforming assets. Classic value extraction. We could have turned a $200 million investment into $500 million in profit within 18 months. Maya listened to his plan with the attention of someone who was learning something fascinating about the speaker's character and competence. That's an interesting approach, she said when he finished. Very different from what the successful bidder is planning. Preston's confidence faltered slightly. How would you know what they're planning? Maya pulled out her phone and opened her email. She turned the screen so that Preston could see the message at the top of her inbox. It was from the Wall Street Journal sent 40 minutes earlier. The subject line read, Titan Capital CEO Maya Rodriguez closes $6 billion Monroe Industries acquisition. Preston stared at the screen for a long moment, his brain struggling to process information that didn't fit with his assumptions about the world and his place in it. Then he looked at Maya's face. Really looked at her for the first time all evening, and realized that the woman he had been dismissing as an undeserving interloper was the same person who had just cost his firm the biggest deal of the year. Captain Rodriguez read the email header over Preston's shoulder and turned to Maya with a new expression of respect. Ms. Rodriguez, he said carefully, I believe you're entitled to any seat on this aircraft that you've properly reserved. Maya smiled. Thank you, Captain. That's all I've ever asked for. But Preston Whitmore was beyond the reach of reason or diplomacy. The revelation of Maya's identity had triggered something primal in his psyche, a rage that came from discovering that someone he considered inferior had bested him in his own area of expertise. "You," he said, pointing at Maya with a trembling finger. "You're the corporate raider who destroyed my deal. You cost my investors $200 million. Maya's expression didn't change. "I offered a superior price for a company that your firm was planning to destroy. That's how capitalism works." Preston stepped closer to Maya, close enough that Captain Rodriguez moved between them. "This is about more than business," Preston snarled. "This is about people like you thinking you can come into spaces where you don't belong, and take things that rightfully belong to people like me." And with those words, Preston Whitmore had just made the situation about race in the most explicit way possible. Maria Santos had been watching the confrontation at Gate A7 with the trained eye of someone who documented discrimination for a living. As a travel blogger who specialized in exposing bias in the hospitality industry, she had developed an instinct for recognizing when a situation was about to escalate beyond simple customer service issues into something that revealed deeper truths about power and prejudice. When Preston Whitmore made his comment about people like Maya not belonging in spaces meant for people like him, Maria knew she was witnessing exactly the kind of moment her followers needed to see. She opened her phone's video app and began recording. "I'm documenting what appears to be a serious incident of discrimination on Coastal Airways Flight 447, she said quietly into her phone's microphone. "A passenger is being confronted about her right to sit in a seat she purchased, and the language being used suggests this is about race rather than seating policies." Maria had 50,000 followers on her YouTube channel and another 30,000 across her social media platforms. Her audience trusted her to document these situations accurately and completely without sensationalism, but also without pulling punches when people revealed their true characters. David Kim noticed Maria recording and felt his stomach clench with the familiar anxiety that came from witnessing racism in public spaces. As a Korean-American tech executive, he had spent his career navigating situations where speaking up might cost him professionally, but staying silent made him complicit in injustice. He pulled out his own phone and began recording from a different angle. Rebecca Thompson, the retired elementary school teacher from Minneapolis, was watching the confrontation with growing horror. She had lived in predominantly white communities for most of her life and had rarely witnessed overt racism, but she was intelligent enough to recognize what she was seeing now. "This is terrible," she whispered to James Rodriguez, the off-duty pilot sitting next to her. "That man is being completely inappropriate." James nodded grimly. As a Hispanic pilot who had worked for 3 different airlines, he understood exactly how company policies were supposed to work in situations like this. What he was watching violated every rule about passenger treatment and conflict resolution. "The captain should end this immediately," James said quietly. "There's no policy that supports removing a passenger from a seat they legally purchased." But Captain Rodriguez was struggling with a situation that had moved beyond simple policy enforcement into something that required judgment about human character and institutional responsibility. Preston was still standing uncomfortably close to Maya. His finger pointed at her face, his voice raised loud enough to be heard throughout the gate area. "You people always play the victim card when you're caught somewhere you don't belong," he said, his professional mask completely gone now. "But I know what this is really about. This is about quotas and diversity initiatives and giving advantages to people who haven't earned them." Maya's response was calm and measured, which made the contrast with Preston's emotional outburst even more stark. "What advantages do you think I've been given, Mr. Whitmore?" Preston gestured broadly as if her presence itself was evidence of some kind of conspiracy. "Affirmative action admissions minority business loans, diversity hiring government contracts set aside for disadvantaged groups. The entire system is rigged to help people like you at the expense of people like me." Maya tilted her head slightly, genuinely curious about his logic. "You think I acquired Monroe Industries through affirmative action?" Preston realized he was in danger of saying something that might expose him to legal liability, but his anger was beyond his ability to control rationally. "I think the playing field isn't level," he said. "I think there are advantages available to certain people that aren't available to everyone." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right about that. There are definitely advantages available to some people that others don't get to access." Preston seemed momentarily encouraged that she was agreeing with him. "Exactly," he said. "It's about fairness and merit and making sure that success is based on actual achievement rather than checking demographic boxes." Maya's smile was serene. "Mr. Whitmore, would you say that attending Phillips Exeter Academy was an advantage that was available to you because of merit or because your grandfather's railroad fortune could afford the tuition?" Preston's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. "What about Yale University?" Maya continued gently. "Did you get accepted because of your test scores or because 3 generations of Whitmores attended before you and your family donated enough money to get a building named after them?" Maria adjusted her phone to make sure she was capturing Maya's questions clearly. This was turning into something much more sophisticated than the typical confrontation video. "How about Harvard Business School?" Maya asked. "Pure merit, or did your family's connections in the financial industry help smooth the way Preston had gone completely pale?" Maya's research into his background was uncomfortably thorough and devastatingly accurate. "And your hedge fund," Maya said with the tone of someone asking about the weather. "Did you start that with money you earned through your superior investment skills? Or did your grandfather's trust fund provide the initial capital?" Captain Rodriguez watched this exchange with fascination. Maya was dismantling Preston's entire argument about merit and fairness by exposing the advantages that had shaped his own path to success. "The difference between us," Mr. Whitmore, Maya said quietly, "isn't that one of us received advantages and the other didn't. The difference is that your advantages were inherited and mine were earned." Preston finally found his voice, but what came out revealed more about his character than any amount of careful questioning could have. "At least my advantages were legitimate," he snarled. "At least they were based on my family's actual achievements rather than guilt and political correctness." The statement hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Preston had just argued that inherited wealth was more legitimate than personal achievement, and that Maya's success must be the result of guilt and political correctness rather than her own capabilities. Maria stopped recording for a moment to check her phone's storage space. She had a feeling this video was going to be longer than usual. Captain Rodriguez had reached the limit of his patience with Preston Whitmore's behavior. As a commercial airline captain, he had the authority to refuse boarding to any passenger who posed a threat to flight safety or crew operations. Racist outbursts definitely qualified as disruptive behavior. "Mr. Whitmore," Captain Rodriguez said firmly, "I'm going to need you to step back and lower your voice. Your behavior is becoming disruptive to other passengers and inappropriate for our gate area." But Preston was beyond the reach of reasonable authority. Maya's destruction of his worldview had triggered something primal and ugly, and he seemed incapable of controlling his response. "Don't tell me about inappropriate behavior," Preston said, whirling to face the captain. "I'm not the one playing the race card to get special treatment. I'm not the one taking seats away from people who actually deserve them." Captain Rodriguez felt his own temper beginning to rise. As a Hispanic man who had faced his share of discrimination in the aviation industry, he recognized the racist undertones in Preston's language. "Mr. Whitmore, Ms. Rodriguez purchased her seat through the same process you used to purchase yours. She deserves exactly the same treatment that any other paying passenger receives." Preston's response revealed the depth of his entitlement and the extent of his delusion about how the world should work. "She deserves treatment based on what she actually contributes," he said. "And people like her contribute less than people like me, no matter what the politically correct crowd wants to pretend." Maya had been letting Preston reveal his character without interference, but his latest comment crossed a line that she felt compelled to address. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "my company paid more in federal taxes last year than your hedge fund has generated in total revenue over the past 5 years. What exactly do you contribute that makes you more deserving of respect than I am?" Preston stared at her with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of social hierarchy had just collapsed. He had built his identity around the assumption that his race, his background, and his inherited advantages made him inherently more valuable than people who didn't share those characteristics. Maya's success challenged that assumption in ways that his mind couldn't process rationally. "You're lying," he said flatly. "No one builds a billion-dollar company from nothing. You had help. You had advantages. You had people clearing the way for you." Maya pulled out her phone and opened her company's website. She turned the screen toward Preston so he could see her biography page, complete with a timeline of Titan Capital's growth from a $50,000 startup to a $12 billion private equity firm. "Would you like me to walk you through the math?" she asked politely. Preston slapped the phone out of her hand. The device clattered across the floor of the gate area and skidded to a stop near Rebecca Thompson's feet. The retired teacher picked it up and checked to make sure it wasn't damaged before handing it back to Maya. The physical contact changed everything. Preston had just committed assault in front of multiple witnesses and security cameras. Captain Rodriguez immediately called for airport security. Jennifer Walsh finally found her voice and began documenting the incident for her incident report. Maria Santos and David Kim both adjusted their recording angles to make sure they had captured Preston's action from multiple perspectives. But Maya's reaction was the most telling of all. She didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice or make any aggressive moves. She simply looked at Preston with the expression of someone who had just watched an opponent make a fatal error in judgment. "Mr. Whitmore," she said calmly, "you just committed assault and battery against a passenger in a commercial airport. That action was recorded by multiple witnesses and captured by airport security cameras." Preston seemed to realize what he had done, but instead of apologizing or de-escalating, he doubled down on his aggression. "You people always claim assault when someone stands up to your manipulation," he said. "You provoked this situation by taking advantages you didn't earn." Captain Rodriguez had heard enough. He pulled out his radio and called for additional security support. "I need backup at gate A7 for an unruly passenger who has committed assault against another passenger," he said into his radio, "requesting immediate assistance for passenger removal and possible criminal charges." Maya picked up her phone and checked to make sure it was still functional. The screen was cracked, but still operational. "Thank you, Captain Rodriguez," she said. "I appreciate your professionalism in handling this situation." She turned to Preston with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Whitmore, you might want to call your lawyer. You're going to need legal representation for the assault charges, and you'll probably want advice about the civil lawsuit that I'll be filing tomorrow morning." Preston's face went from red to pale in the space of a heartbeat. The legal implications of his actions were finally penetrating his rage. "Civil lawsuit," Maya's smile widened. "Assault, battery, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of my civil rights under federal anti-discrimination statutes. My legal team is very good at documenting patterns of racist behavior and translating them into monetary damages." She paused for a moment, considering something. "Of course, the civil suit will be the least of your problems if this video goes viral. Your professional reputation, your client relationships, your standing in the financial community, those might be harder to recover than any amount of money you end up owing me." Preston looked around the gate area and saw Maria Santos still recording David Kim, documenting everything from another angle, Rebecca Thompson looking at him with obvious disgust, and James Rodriguez shaking his head in professional disapproval. For the first time all evening, Preston Whitmore realized that he might have made a mistake that money and connections couldn't fix. 2 airport security officers arrived at Gate A7 within 3 minutes of Captain Rodriguez's call. Officer Sarah Mitchell, a tall black woman in her 30s, and Officer Robert Hayes, a white man in his 40s, approached the scene with the professional caution that came from dealing with passenger disputes that had escalated beyond airline staff capabilities. Officer Mitchell immediately assessed the situation by speaking to Captain Rodriguez, who provided a concise summary of Preston's behavior and the physical assault against Maya. "We have multiple witnesses to the assault," Captain Rodriguez explained, "and at least 2 passengers recorded the entire incident. The victim has indicated that she intends to press charges." Officer Hayes approached Preston, who was still standing near Maya, but had finally backed away after realizing the legal implications of his actions. "Sir, I need you to step away from the other passenger and come with me," Officer Hayes said firmly but professionally. "We need to discuss what happened here tonight." Preston's entitlement hadn't completely disappeared, even in the face of criminal liability. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "I'm a frequent traveler with this airline, and I was simply trying to resolve a seating dispute. This woman has been deliberately provocative, and she's trying to make this about race when it's really about airline policies." Officer Mitchell exchanged glances with her partner. They had both handled enough discrimination complaints to recognize the standard deflection strategy that people used when their bias was exposed publicly. "Sir, we'll need to hear your version of events," Officer Mitchell said diplomatically. "But first we need to separate you from the other passengers while we gather information." Maya approached Officer Mitchell with her driver's license and boarding pass. "Officer, I'd like to file formal charges against Mr. Whitmore for assault and battery. He deliberately knocked my phone out of my hand during a verbal confrontation, and the entire incident was recorded by multiple witnesses." Officer Mitchell examined Maya's identification and noted her calm, professional demeanor. In her experience, passengers who were lying or exaggerating usually showed signs of emotional distress or anger. Maya seemed composed and focused on the facts rather than her feelings. "Ma'am, can you walk me through exactly what happened?" Maya provided a chronological account of the evening's events from Preston's initial assumption that she didn't belong in first class through his escalating racist comments to the physical assault. Her description was precise, factual, and completely consistent with what the officers could observe about the aftermath. Officer Hayes was taking Preston's statement 20 feet away, and even from a distance it was clear that Preston's version of events involved significantly more emotion and significantly less coherence than Maya's account. Maria Santos approached Officer Mitchell with her phone. "Excuse me, officer. I recorded the entire confrontation from the beginning. Would you like me to send you a copy of the video for your report?" Officer Mitchell nodded gratefully. "Video evidence made these cases much easier to document and prosecute. That would be very helpful. Could you also provide your contact information in case we need additional witness testimony?" David Kim also stepped forward with his phone. "I recorded from a different angle. I can provide that video as well, along with my witness statement." Rebecca Thompson and James Rodriguez also volunteered to provide witness statements supporting Maya's account of events. Officer Mitchell found herself in the unusual position of investigating an assault case where the evidence was overwhelming and the witnesses were eager to cooperate. Usually passenger disputes involved conflicting accounts and reluctant witnesses who didn't want to get involved. Maya's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and saw that her assistant had sent her a link to Twitter. Flight 447 discrimination incident was already trending. Maya showed the screen to Officer Mitchell. "It appears that some of the video footage has already been posted on social media." Officer Mitchell sighed. Social media had made her job both easier and more complicated. Viral videos provided excellent evidence for criminal cases, but they also created public pressure that could complicate investigations. She looked over at Preston, who was gesturing wildly while speaking to Officer Hayes. Preston seemed completely unaware that his behavior was being documented in real time and shared with thousands of people. "Ma'am," Officer Mitchell said to Maya, "would you be willing to come to the security office to complete your statement and review the video evidence?" We'll also need to process Mr. Whitmore and determine whether he'll be released pending charges or held until his arraignment. Maya nodded. Of course. Should I arrange for my flight to be rescheduled? Officer Mitchell glanced back toward the gate where Jennifer Walsh was speaking anxiously into her radio. That might be advisable, she said diplomatically. This investigation might take several hours, and I suspect the airline is going to want to review their own policies before allowing Mr. Whitmore to board any aircraft tonight. As Maya gathered her carry-on bag and prepared to accompany the officers to the security office, she noticed that Preston was still arguing with Officer Hayes about the unfairness of the situation he had created for himself. She felt a moment of something that might have been pity. Preston Whitmore had just destroyed his career, his reputation, and probably his freedom because he couldn't accept that a black woman might be more successful than he was. But the pity passed quickly. Maya had spent her entire career dealing with men like Preston who believed that their advantages made them superior to people who had actually earned their success. Tonight, Preston was finally going to learn about consequences. By the time Maya reached the airport security office, Flight 447 was the number 3 trending topic on Twitter in the United States, and the hashtag Coastal Airways discrimination had been used in over 10,000 posts. Maria Santos had uploaded a 15-minute video to her YouTube channel titled Racist Passenger Attacks Black CEO on Airplane, Full Documentation. The video had received 20,000 views in the first 30 minutes after posting, with comments pouring in from viewers who were sharing their own experiences of discrimination in travel. David Kim had posted a shorter video to his Twitter account with the caption, "This is what privilege looks like when it's challenged by actual success." His video focused specifically on Preston's comments about advantages and quotas, with devastating clarity about the racist assumptions underlying his arguments. Maya's assistant, Sarah Martinez, had been monitoring social media from Titan Capital's Los Angeles office and calling Maya every 10 minutes with updates about the viral spread of the incident. "Maya, this is huge," Sarah said during their latest call. CNN, Fox Business, and MSNBC have all reached out for comments. The Wall Street Journal wants to do a feature story about discrimination in business travel, and we've received interview requests from 67 different media outlets in the last 2 hours. Maya was sitting in a conference room at the airport security office, reviewing her written statement before signing it when Sarah called with the most significant development. "Maya, you need to see this. Someone identified Preston Whitmore, and now people are digging into his background." Maya put her phone on speaker, so Officer Mitchell could hear the conversation. "What are they finding?" Maya asked. "His hedge fund has had 3 major discrimination lawsuits filed against it in the past 5 years, all settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. But now people are connecting the dots between tonight's behavior and a pattern of racist conduct in his professional life." Officer Mitchell raised her eyebrows. Pattern evidence could be crucial for determining whether Preston's assault against Maya was motivated by racial bias, which would elevate the charges to hate crime status. "There's more," Sarah continued. "Someone found his college yearbook photos from Yale. There are pictures of him at a party where he's wearing blackface." Maya closed her eyes and shook her head. The Internet's ability to research someone's entire life history in real time was terrifying and occasionally useful. "How old are those photos?" 23 years old, but they're circulating widely. And Maya, his hedge fund's largest client, just issued a statement saying they're reviewing their relationship with his firm in light of recent events. Maya realized that Preston's problems were escalating far beyond criminal charges and civil liability. When major institutional investors started distancing themselves from a hedge fund manager, it usually meant the end of their career. "Are there any statements from Coastal Airways yet?" Maya asked. "Just a generic statement saying they're investigating the incident and don't tolerate discrimination. But social media is flooded with people sharing their own stories about bias from Coastal Airways staff. This is turning into a much bigger story than just one incident." Officer Mitchell finished reviewing Maya's statement and handed her a copy of the assault report. Ms. Rodriguez will be charging Mr. Whitmore with assault and battery, and we're also investigating possible hate crime enhancements based on the racist language documented in the witness videos. He'll be released on his own recognizance tonight, but he has a court date next week. Maya nodded. Thank you for your professionalism in handling this situation. Ma'am, I want you to know that what happened to you tonight was completely unacceptable. No passenger should have to experience that kind of harassment, and Mr. Whitmore's behavior violated both airline policies and federal laws about discrimination in public accommodations. Maya's phone buzzed with another call from Sarah Martinez. Maya, you're not going to believe this. Coastal Airways stock price is down 12% in after-hours trading. Investors are concerned about potential boycotts and legal liability from discrimination lawsuits. Maya felt a familiar sensation in her chest, the same feeling she got when she identified a distressed company that could be acquired and restructured for massive profits. Sarah, I want you to research Coastal Airways' financial situation. Debt structure, cash flow, major shareholders, supplier relationships. Everything. Are you thinking about an acquisition? Maya smiled for the first time since the incident began. I'm thinking about justice, but justice can be profitable if you approach it strategically. Officer Mitchell looked at Maya with curiosity. Ma'am, are you planning some kind of business response to this incident? Maya's smile widened. Officer, I believe in addressing problems comprehensively. Mr. Whitmore's behavior tonight was a symptom of larger issues with institutional bias and corporate culture. Sometimes the best way to solve widespread problems is through changes in ownership and management. As Maya left the airport security office 3 hours later, she pulled out her phone and made a call to her chief financial officer. Marcus, it's Maya. I want you to start researching acquisition opportunities in the commercial aviation sector. Specifically, I want to know everything about Coastal Airways' vulnerabilities. Preston Whitmore had just learned that Maya Rodriguez was the wrong person to underestimate. But Coastal Airways was about to learn that she was also the wrong person to humiliate. By 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Maya Rodriguez had become the most recognizable face in business news. The Wall Street Journal's morning edition led with the headline, Private Equity CEO Assaulted After Airline Discrimination Incident, and the story had generated more online engagement than any business article published that year. Financial news networks across the country were running the airport security footage on continuous loops with expert commentators analyzing the incident from legal, business, and social perspectives. Maya's calm professionalism during the confrontation had been contrasted with Preston Whitmore's emotional outburst in ways that made their character differences impossible to ignore. But the revelation that truly sent shockwaves through the financial community was the connection between Maya's Titan capital management and the Monroe Industries acquisition that Preston had been discussing during his racist tirade. CNBC's morning show featured a timeline graphic that illustrated the devastating irony of the situation. Preston Whitmore had spent months trying to acquire Monroe Industries for his investment fund, only to lose the deal to Maya Rodriguez, then unknowingly insulted and assaulted the same woman who had outmaneuvered him professionally. This is one of the most spectacular cases of ironic justice that we've ever documented in the business world, said Rebecca Morrison, a business journalist who specialized in private equity acquisitions. Preston Whitmore essentially destroyed his own career by attacking the person who had already demonstrated superior business acumen by beating him in a 9-figure acquisition battle. The financial press was having a field day with the mathematical precision of Preston's downfall. His hedge fund, Whitmore Capital Strategies, had been managing $1.2 billion in assets before the incident. By Thursday morning, they had received withdrawal notices from institutional investors representing $800 million. Maya's assistant, Sarah Martinez, was fielding interview requests from every major business publication in the United States. Harvard Business School had called to request permission to develop a case study about the incident for their executive education programs. 3 different documentary filmmakers had submitted proposals for feature-length films about Maya's career, but Maya was more interested in the operational details that most media coverage was overlooking. Monroe Industries held exclusive supplier contracts with 17 different airlines, including Coastal Airways. Those contracts included pricing agreements, delivery schedules, and performance standards that gave Monroe significant leverage over airline operations. Coastal Airways was particularly dependent on Monroe for engine components and hydraulic systems that were critical for flight safety. The exclusive contract gave them preferential pricing and priority delivery advantages that had helped them compete with larger airlines despite their smaller size. That contract had just become Maya's most powerful weapon. Maya was reviewing Monroe's supplier agreements in her hotel room at the LAX Marriott when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Richard Hamilton, Chief Executive Officer of Coastal Airways. Maya let the phone ring 4 times before answering. Maya Rodriguez. Ms. Rodriguez, this is Richard Hamilton from Coastal Airways. I'm calling to personally apologize for the completely unacceptable treatment you received from our staff last night. Hamilton's voice carried the practiced tone of a corporate executive who had been coached by crisis management consultants on how to handle public relations disasters. I appreciate your call, Mr. Hamilton, Maya said neutrally. I want to assure you that the behavior you experienced does not represent our company's values or policies. We are conducting a comprehensive investigation into the incident, and we will take appropriate action to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. Maya understood that Hamilton was reading from a script designed to minimize legal liability while expressing concern for her welfare. It was the kind of carefully worded apology that corporate lawyers wrote to sound sincere without admitting fault. Mr. Hamilton, what specific actions is Coastal Airways taking to address the institutional problems that allowed this incident to occur? Hamilton paused, apparently not expecting such a direct question about company policies. Well, we're reviewing our customer service training programs, and we'll be implementing additional training for all passenger-facing staff members. Maya nodded, though Hamilton couldn't see her. Training is certainly important, but I'm more interested in accountability measures and structural changes that address the underlying issues. Of course, Hamilton said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure what structural changes Maya might be referring to. We're committed to making whatever changes are necessary to prevent future incidents. Maya decided to test Hamilton's commitment to accountability. Mr. Hamilton will. Jennifer Walsh, the gate agent who participated in the discrimination against me, face any consequences for her actions. Another pause. We're still investigating the specific circumstances, but any employee who violated company policies will face appropriate disciplinary action. Maya understood that Hamilton was avoiding any commitment to specific consequences, probably because Coastal Airways was more concerned about wrongful termination lawsuits than they were about addressing discrimination. I see, Maya said. And what about the institutional culture that created an environment where Ms. Walsh felt comfortable making discriminatory assumptions about passengers based on their race and appearance? Hamilton's discomfort was becoming audible. Ms. Rodriguez. We take all allegations of discrimination very seriously, and we're committed to fostering an inclusive environment for all passengers. Maya realized that Hamilton was going to continue delivering corporate talking points indefinitely, unless she changed the direction of the conversation. Mr. Hamilton, are you familiar with Monroe Industries? I'm sorry. Monroe Industries. The aerospace parts manufacturer. They supply critical components for your aircraft fleet. Hamilton's voice changed slightly, taking on the tone of someone who was no longer reading from a script. Yes, Monroe is one of our key suppliers. They provide engine components and hydraulic systems under an exclusive contract. Maya smiled. That's correct. And as of yesterday afternoon, I'm the majority owner of Monroe Industries. The silence that followed was profound enough to be measured in geological time. Maya ended her call with Richard Hamilton and immediately contacted her executive team for an emergency strategy meeting. Within 2 hours, the senior leadership of Titan Capital Management had assembled in the conference room of their Century City offices, ready to discuss what Maya was already thinking of as the Coastal Airways acquisition. Sarah Martinez, chief legal counsel, had spent the morning reviewing Coastal Airways' corporate structure, debt obligations, and regulatory relationships. Her preliminary research suggested that the airline was more vulnerable to a hostile takeover than most people realized. Maya Coastal Airways has been struggling financially for the past 3 years, Sarah reported. Their debt-to-equity ratio is concerning their cash flow is inconsistent, and they've been burning through credit lines to fund operations. They're not in immediate danger of bankruptcy, but they're definitely not in a position to weather any major disruptions to their business model. Marcus Chen, chief financial officer, had been analyzing Coastal Airways' stock performance and institutional investor relationships. His findings were equally encouraging from an acquisition perspective. The company's market capitalization is currently $2.8 billion, but that's down 37% from their peak value 2 years ago. Their largest institutional shareholders are pension funds and index funds that would probably welcome a buyout offer at a reasonable premium. Maya nodded thoughtfully. What about their supplier relationships? How dependent are they on Monroe Industries, specifically David Park, Director of Operations Research, had been reviewing the exclusive supplier contract between Monroe and Coastal Airways since Maya first mentioned it. Maya, this contract is remarkable in its scope and specificity. Monroe supplies 63% of Coastal Airways' critical replacement parts, including engine components that are essential for flight safety. The contract gives Coastal Airways preferential pricing and guaranteed delivery schedules that their competitors don't have access to. Sarah leaned forward with interest. What happens if that contract is terminated or modified? David consulted his notes. Coastal Airways would be forced to source parts from alternative suppliers at significantly higher prices, with longer delivery times and no guarantee of priority service. Their maintenance costs would increase by an estimated 40 to 60%, and their operational flexibility would be severely compromised. Maya felt the familiar excitement that came from identifying a perfect strategic opportunity. Coastal Airways had humiliated her because they assumed she was powerless. They were about to learn that she controlled the most critical aspect of their business operations. Marcus, what would a hostile takeover of Coastal Airways look like from a financial perspective? Marcus had clearly been thinking about the same question. Based on their current market cap and debt structure, we could probably acquire controlling interest for approximately $4 billion. That would require significant financing, but it's well within our capabilities. Sarah raised her hand slightly. Maya, are we sure we want to pursue an acquisition strategy rather than a lawsuit? The legal case for discrimination is very strong, and we could probably win substantial monetary damages without the complexity of purchasing an entire airline. Maya considered the question carefully. A lawsuit would provide personal vindication and financial compensation, but it wouldn't address the broader issues that had created the environment where her discrimination was possible. Sarah, lawsuits change individual behavior through fear of consequences, but acquisitions change institutional culture through changes in leadership and accountability structures. If we want to prevent other people from experiencing what I experienced last night, we need to change the system, not just punish the individuals. Maria Gonzalez, Director of Public Relations, had been monitoring social media and news coverage throughout the morning. Her assessment of public opinion was crucial for determining how an acquisition attempt might be received. Maya, the public response to last night's incident has been overwhelmingly supportive of you and critical of Coastal Airways. The hashtag Coastal Airways discrimination has been shared over 100,000 times, and consumer advocacy groups are already calling for boycotts. She pulled up several social media analytics on her tablet. More importantly, the financial press is covering this as a business story rather than just a social justice story. If we announce an acquisition attempt, it will be seen as a logical business response to poor management and institutional problems, rather than a purely emotional reaction. Maya stood up and walked to the window overlooking Century City. She could see the airport in the distance where Flight 447 was probably preparing for its next departure with a crew that had learned nothing from the previous night's incident. "Here's what we're going to do," Maya said, turning back to face her team. "Marcus, I want you to start assembling the financing for a $4 billion acquisition. Use our existing credit facilities and establish relationships with additional institutional lenders." Marcus nodded and began making notes. "Sarah, I want you to research the legal framework for using Monroe Industries' supplier contract as leverage in acquisition negotiations. What are our options for modifying or terminating the exclusive agreement with Coastal Airways?" Sarah was already thinking about the possibilities. "We'll need to review the termination clauses in detail, but most commercial contracts include provisions for breach of performance or changes in business circumstances." Maya continued assigning responsibilities. "David, I want a comprehensive analysis of Coastal Airways' operational vulnerabilities. Which routes are most profitable, which aircraft are newest, which employee contracts are most expensive. Everything." David nodded eagerly. "I'll have a preliminary report by tomorrow morning. Maria, I want you to prepare a public relations strategy that frames this acquisition as a business decision based on poor management and institutional problems rather than a personal vendetta. We want the narrative to focus on improving airline operations and customer service rather than revenge." Maria was already thinking about messaging strategies. "Maya, we should emphasize your track record of acquiring distressed companies and improving their performance. Position this as another example of Titan Capital's expertise in fixing broken organizations." Maya smiled. "Exactly. Preston Whitmore and Jennifer Walsh created this situation by assuming I was powerless. Now we're going to demonstrate what actual power looks like when it's applied strategically." She looked around the room at her team, each of them energized by the challenge of a complex acquisition in an industry where Titan Capital had never operated before. "One more thing," Maya said. "I want this acquisition completed within 60 days. Coastal Airways is going to learn that discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's also very expensive." At 9:00 a.m. Pacific Time on Thursday morning, exactly 10 hours after Preston Whitmore had slapped Maya's phone out of her hand, Maya Rodriguez authorized the first strategic strike in what would become known in business schools as the most comprehensive corporate response to discrimination in modern history. The weapon was elegantly simple. Maya instructed Monroe Industries' legal team to conduct a comprehensive review of all supplier contracts with Coastal Airways, with particular attention to performance standards, quality control requirements, and grounds for contract modification or termination. What they found was exactly what Maya had hoped for. The exclusive supplier agreement between Monroe Industries and Coastal Airways contained a section that had been largely ignored by previous management. A business reputation clause that allowed Monroe to terminate the contract if Coastal Airways engaged in conduct that was materially harmful to Monroe Industries' business reputation or contrary to Monroe Industries' corporate values. Maya's legal team determined that Coastal Airways' discriminatory treatment of Maya, combined with the viral video footage that had associated the airline with racist behavior, constituted conduct that was materially harmful to Monroe Industries' business reputation. At 10:30 a.m., Monroe Industries' chief legal counsel delivered a formal letter to Coastal Airways' corporate headquarters in Denver. The letter informed Coastal Airways that Monroe Industries was invoking the business reputation clause and providing them with 72 hours to cure the breach by implementing comprehensive reforms to eliminate discriminatory practices in customer service operations. The letter also specified exactly what reforms would be considered adequate to cure the breach termination of all employees who had participated in discriminatory conduct implementation of mandatory anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff establishment of an independent oversight committee to monitor customer service practices and public acknowledgement of institutional failures that had enabled discrimination. Coastal Airways executives received the letter at 11:15 a.m. and immediately understood the implications. Monroe Industries supplied critical engine components that Coastal Airways needed for flight safety. Without those parts, Coastal Airways would be forced to ground significant portions of their fleet within weeks. Richard Hamilton called an emergency meeting of Coastal Airways' executive team and their legal counsel. The agenda was simple: determine how to respond to Monroe Industries' ultimatum without admitting liability for discrimination or creating precedents that might encourage other suppliers to make similar demands. Hamilton's first instinct was to call Maya directly and negotiate some kind of compromise. But his legal team advised against any direct contact with Maya while she was threatening to file civil rights lawsuits against the company. His second instinct was to find alternative suppliers for the engine components that Monroe Industries provided, but his operations team reported that there were only 2 other manufacturers capable of producing the specific parts that Coastal Airways needed, and both had waiting lists that extended 6 to 8 months. Hamilton realized that Maya had placed Coastal Airways in an impossible situation. They couldn't afford to meet Monroe Industries' demands because doing so would constitute admission of liability for discrimination. But they also couldn't afford to lose Monroe Industries as a supplier because doing so would cripple their operations. Hamilton called his chief financial officer and asked for an immediate assessment of Coastal Airways' financial position in a scenario where their parts costs increased by 60% due to supplier changes. The CFO's response was not encouraging. "Richard, if we lose the Monroe Industries contract, we're looking at an additional $40 million in annual parts costs, plus the operational disruptions from sourcing components from less reliable suppliers. We're already operating on thin margins, and we don't have the cash flow to absorb that kind of cost increase." Hamilton stared out his office window at the Denver skyline and realized that Maya Rodriguez had just demonstrated the difference between inherited privilege and earned power. Preston Whitmore had inherited his wealth and assumed that it made him superior to people who didn't share his advantages. Maya Rodriguez had built her wealth strategically and was now using it as a weapon against institutional discrimination. At 2:00 p.m., Hamilton called Coastal Airways' board of directors and requested an emergency meeting to discuss supplier relationship issues that could materially affect company operations. He didn't mention that the supplier relationship issues had been created by his employees' decision to discriminate against the supplier's owner. At 2:30 p.m., Maya received a call from Monroe Industries' chief operations officer, informing her that Coastal Airways had requested a meeting to discuss potential modifications to contract terms and performance standards. Maya smiled and instructed Monroe's leadership to schedule the meeting for Monday morning. She wanted Coastal Airways to spend the weekend thinking about the consequences of discrimination. But more importantly, she wanted them to understand that this was just the beginning of their problems. At 4:47 p.m. on Friday afternoon, exactly 48 hours after the incident at Gate A7, Maya Rodriguez answered her phone on the first ring. Maya Rodriguez. "Ms. Rodriguez, this is Richard Hamilton from Coastal Airways. I believe we need to have a serious conversation about the situation involving Monroe Industries." Maya had been expecting this call since Monroe Industries delivered their ultimatum. Hamilton's voice carried the carefully controlled tension of a man who was trying to negotiate from a position of weakness while maintaining the illusion of authority. "Mr. Hamilton, I am certainly willing to discuss Monroe Industries' concerns about their business relationship with Coastal Airways." Maya's tone was professional and neutral, giving no indication of the comprehensive strategy that her team had been developing for the past 2 days. "Ms. Rodriguez, I want to be direct with you. The contract terms that Monroe Industries is trying to enforce are unprecedented in the aviation industry. No supplier has ever demanded oversight of an airline's employment decisions as a condition of continuing parts delivery." Maya leaned back in her chair and smiled. Hamilton was trying to frame Monroe Industries' demands as unreasonable business practices, rather than addressing the discriminatory behavior that had triggered the contract review. "Mr. Hamilton, the business reputation clause in your contract with Monroe Industries has been part of that agreement for 6 years. Your company's legal team reviewed and approved those terms when the contract was originally signed. Hamilton's pause suggested that he hadn't realized Maya was personally familiar with the contract details. Yes, well, we understood those terms to refer to criminal activity or major financial scandals, not isolated customer service incidents. Maya's voice sharpened slightly. Mr. Hamilton, are you characterizing the racist assault against me as an isolated customer service incident? Another pause longer this time. Hamilton realized that he had just minimized a hate crime in front of a witness who was almost certainly recording their conversation. Of course not, Ms. Rodriguez. What happened to you was completely unacceptable, and we've already taken steps to address the individuals involved. Maya decided to test Hamilton's definition of steps to address. What specific actions has Coastal Airways taken regarding Jennifer Walsh, the gate agent who participated in the discrimination against me? Hamilton's discomfort was audible. Ms. Walsh has been placed on administrative leave pending a comprehensive investigation of the incident. Maya understood that administrative leave pending investigation was corporate speak for waiting for public attention to die down before quietly reinstating the employee. I see. And what about the institutional policies that created an environment where Ms. Walsh felt comfortable making discriminatory assumptions about passengers? We're implementing additional training programs for all customer service staff. Maya nodded, though Hamilton couldn't see her. Training programs were the standard response that companies used to address discrimination complaints without actually changing their hiring practices or accountability structures. Mr. Hamilton, Monroe Industries' demands aren't about training programs. They're about fundamental changes in corporate culture and accountability that ensure discrimination doesn't happen again. Hamilton's voice took on a slightly pleading tone. Ms. Rodriguez, surely we can find a middle ground here. Coastal Airways is committed to treating all passengers fairly, and we're willing to make reasonable accommodations to address any concerns. Maya felt a familiar cold calculation settling over her mind. Hamilton was still trying to negotiate as if he had leverage in this situation. Mr. Hamilton, what do you know about my background? The change of subject seemed to confuse Hamilton. I know that you're a successful businesswoman who was treated inappropriately by our staff. Maya smiled. I'm the founder and CEO of a $12 billion private equity firm that specializes in acquiring distressed companies and restructuring their operations for improved performance. Hamilton was quiet for a moment, apparently processing the implications of Maya's description of her expertise. Mr. Hamilton, your airline's market capitalization is currently $2.8 billion. Your debt-to-equity ratio is 1.7 to 1. Your cash flow has been negative for 6 of the past 12 quarters. Your largest institutional shareholders are pension funds that would welcome a buyout offer at a reasonable premium. Maya paused to let Hamilton absorb the information. In other words, Mr. Hamilton, Coastal Airways is exactly the kind of distressed company that Titan Capital Management acquires and restructures. Hamilton's voice was barely above a whisper. Ms. Rodriguez, are you threatening a hostile takeover? Maya's voice remained perfectly calm and professional. Mr. Hamilton, I'm simply observing that companies with poor management and institutional problems often become acquisition targets for firms like mine. She paused again, allowing Hamilton to imagine the implications. Of course, if Coastal Airways were to demonstrate genuine commitment to addressing its cultural problems and accountability failures that might change the assessment of whether the company represents an attractive acquisition opportunity. Hamilton understood that Maya had just offered him a choice: implement comprehensive reforms to eliminate discrimination or face a hostile takeover that would replace his entire management team. Ms. Rodriguez, what specific reforms would Monroe Industries consider adequate to resolve this situation? Maya pulled out the list that her legal team had prepared. Termination of all employees who participated in discriminatory conduct. implementation of mandatory anti-bias training with measurable outcomes, establishment of an independent oversight committee with authority to investigate discrimination complaints, and public acknowledgement of the institutional failures that enabled this incident. Hamilton was quiet for a long time. Each of Maya's demands would require significant financial investment and create legal precedents that could expose Coastal Airways to additional liability. Ms. Rodriguez, some of those demands could expose the company to wrongful termination lawsuits and other legal risks. Maya's smile widened. Mr. Hamilton, discrimination lawsuits are much more expensive than wrongful termination lawsuits, and hostile takeovers are more expensive than both. Hamilton realized that Maya had just given him a mathematical analysis of his options, and every alternative to compliance with her demands involved higher costs and greater risks. How long do we have to consider these options? Maya glanced at her watch. Monroe Industries' ultimatum expires at 5:00 p.m. on Monday. After that, the exclusive supplier contract will be terminated and Coastal Airways will need to find alternative sources for critical engine components. She paused for effect. And after that, Mr. Hamilton Titan Capital Management will begin evaluating Coastal Airways as a potential acquisition target. Hamilton realized that Maya had just given him the weekend to choose between accepting her demands or fighting a war that he couldn't win. Ms. Rodriguez, I appreciate your directness. We'll need to discuss these options with our board of directors. Maya's voice softened slightly, taking on the tone of someone offering helpful advice. Mr. Hamilton, I'd recommend moving quickly. Institutional investors don't like uncertainty, and your stock price has already declined 15% since news of the discrimination incident went viral. Hamilton hung up the phone and stared at his reflection in his office window. In 37 years of airline management, he had never been outmaneuvered so completely by a single phone call. Maya Rodriguez hadn't just threatened him. She had educated him about the cost of discrimination in language that any businessman could understand. At exactly 5:01 p.m. Pacific Time on Monday afternoon, Monroe Industries' chief legal counsel delivered a formal contract termination notice to Coastal Airways corporate headquarters. The timing was deliberate and symbolic. Maya Rodriguez had given Richard Hamilton precisely 72 hours to implement comprehensive reforms to address institutional discrimination, and Hamilton had spent those 72 hours trying to find a way to avoid accountability rather than accepting responsibility. The termination notice was legally precise and operationally devastating. Monroe Industries was immediately ceasing all parts delivery to Coastal Airways, canceling all pending orders and terminating the exclusive supplier relationship that had provided Coastal Airways with preferential pricing and priority service for 6 years. Hamilton received the termination notice at 5:23 p.m. and immediately called an emergency meeting of Coastal Airways' executive team. His chief operations officer delivered the operational implications in language that made every executive in the room understand the magnitude of their crisis. We have a 14-day supply of critical engine components in our inventory. After that, we'll need parts from alternative suppliers who charge 60% more than Monroe Industries and have delivery schedules that extend 4 to 6 weeks. We're looking at grounding 30% of our fleet within a month if we can't secure alternative parts sourcing immediately. Hamilton's chief financial officer provided the financial analysis. The increased parts costs will add approximately $40 million annually to our operational expenses. Combined with the reduced capacity from grounded aircraft, we're looking at a net impact of $70 to $80 million per year. Hamilton stared at the numbers and realized that Maya Rodriguez had just demonstrated the difference between theoretical power and actual power. Preston Whitmore had assumed that his inherited wealth and social connections gave him authority over people like Maya. But Maya owned the supply chain that kept Coastal Airways aircraft in the air. She had just turned off that supply chain with a single phone call. Hamilton's director of procurement spent the next 6 hours calling every aerospace parts manufacturer in the United States, trying to arrange emergency sourcing for the components that Monroe Industries had been providing. The response from alternative suppliers was uniformly discouraging. They were operating at full capacity, servicing their existing clients, and emergency orders would require premium pricing and extended delivery schedules. By Tuesday morning, Coastal Airways faced a choice between accepting parts costs that would eliminate their profit margins or grounding aircraft that generated their revenue. Hamilton realized that Maya had created a scenario where every possible decision would damage the company's financial position. But the operational crisis was only the beginning of Coastal Airways' problems. Maya's strategic vision extended far beyond supplier relationships. On Tuesday afternoon, major institutional investors who held Coastal Airways stock began receiving detailed financial analyses from anonymous sources. These analyses highlighted Coastal Airways' dependence on Monroe Industries, the financial implications of the contract termination, and the company's vulnerability to operational disruptions. The analyses were professionally prepared and mathematically precise, presenting Coastal Airways' situation as a case study in how poor management decisions could create existential threats to business operations. The discrimination incident was framed as evidence of institutional failures that posed ongoing risks to company reputation and financial performance. By Wednesday morning, Coastal Airways' stock price had dropped an additional 23%, and 3 major institutional shareholders had issued public statements expressing concern about the company's operational vulnerabilities and management accountability issues. Hamilton realized that someone was conducting a comprehensive campaign to undermine investor confidence in Coastal Airways' leadership and financial prospects. The campaign was too sophisticated and too well coordinated to be the result of random market forces. Hamilton called Maya directly on Wednesday afternoon. "Ms. Rodriguez, I believe we need to discuss the situation between our companies." Maya's voice was professionally neutral. "Mr. Hamilton, Titan Capital Management doesn't have any business relationship with Coastal Airways." "Are you calling about the Monroe Industries contract termination?" Hamilton understood that Maya was forcing him to acknowledge that their problems stemmed from Coastal Airways' discriminatory treatment of her, rather than any conventional business dispute. "Ms. Rodriguez, I want to discuss the possibility of reinstating the Monroe Industries supplier relationship under modified terms." Maya's response was immediate and unambiguous. "Mr. Hamilton, Monroe Industries terminated their relationship with Coastal Airways due to conduct that was materially harmful to Monroe Industries' business reputation. That contract termination is permanent." Hamilton felt his last hope of easy resolution disappearing. "Ms. Rodriguez, surely there's some accommodation we can reach. Coastal Airways is willing to implement additional training programs and oversight measures." Maya's voice sharpened slightly. "Mr. Hamilton, you had 72 hours to implement the reforms that Monroe Industries requested. Instead of addressing institutional discrimination, you spent that time trying to avoid accountability. Monroe Industries has no interest in restoring a business relationship with a company that refuses to acknowledge or address problems." Hamilton realized that Maya was using business language to describe moral failures. She was treating discrimination as a breach of contract issue and responding with the same ruthless efficiency that she would apply to any other business problem. "Ms. Rodriguez, what would it take to restore our business relationship?" Maya's answer was simple and final. "Mr. Hamilton, some bridges can't be rebuilt, some trust can't be restored. Coastal Airways made a choice about what kind of company it wanted to be, and Monroe Industries has made a choice about what kind of companies it wants to do business with." Hamilton hung up the phone and realized that Maya Rodriguez had just declared war on Coastal Airways, using weapons that he didn't know how to defend against. She wasn't just attacking the company financially, she was attacking it morally, operationally, and strategically, all while maintaining the appearance of conducting legitimate business decisions based on reasonable criteria. Hamilton looked at his stock price monitor and watched Coastal Airways' market value continue to decline in real time. Maya Rodriguez was winning. While Maya Rodriguez was strategically dismantling Coastal Airways' business operations, Preston Whitmore was discovering that consequences extended far beyond criminal charges and civil liability. By Wednesday morning, Whitmore Capital Strategies had received formal withdrawal notices from institutional investors, representing $1.1 billion in assets under management. The withdrawal notices were professionally worded and cited concerns about reputational risks and management judgment rather than explicitly mentioning Preston's racist behavior. But the message was unmistakable. Preston's largest client, the California Public Employees Retirement System, issued a public statement explaining their decision to terminate their relationship with Whitmore Capital Strategies. CalPERS does not tolerate discrimination in any form, and we cannot maintain business relationships with firms whose leadership has demonstrated conduct that violates our values and fiduciary responsibilities. The statement was devastating because CalPERS managed $400 billion in assets and influenced investment decisions across the institutional investor community. When CalPERS terminated a business relationship for ethical reasons, other pension funds and endowments typically followed their lead to avoid appearing supportive of discriminatory behavior. Preston called an emergency meeting with his firm's remaining partners to discuss damage control strategies. The meeting lasted 17 minutes and ended with two senior partners submitting their resignations and the firm's chief compliance officer recommending immediate dissolution of the company. "Preston, we can't recover from this," explained Sarah Hendricks, who had been Preston's business partner for 8 years. "Our client base was built on relationships of trust and professional reputation. The video footage of your behavior has destroyed both." Preston tried to argue that the incident had been blown out of proportion by social media and that institutional investors would eventually recognize his professional competence despite his personal mistakes. Sarah's response was mathematical rather than emotional. "Preston, we've lost 92% of our assets under management in less than a week. The remaining clients are demanding fee reductions to compensate for reputational damage. We don't have enough revenue to cover our operational expenses." Preston realized that his professional career had been destroyed more thoroughly than he had thought possible. Maya Rodriguez hadn't filed any lawsuits against him personally, hadn't made any public statements attacking his business competence, and hadn't directly contacted any of his clients. She hadn't needed to. The video footage of Preston's racist outburst had provided institutional investors with all the evidence they needed to conclude that he represented an unacceptable reputational risk. Preston's personal finances were equally catastrophic. His compensation at Whitmore Capital Strategies was tied to assets under management and investment performance. With the firm's client base disappearing, Preston's income had effectively dropped to zero overnight. His Upper East Side apartment was purchased with a mortgage that assumed consistent income from his hedge fund activities. His children's private school tuition, his wife's shopping habits, and his country club memberships were all predicated on maintaining the lifestyle that his professional success had enabled. Preston's wife, Catherine Whitmore, had filed for divorce on Tuesday morning after consultations with 3 different attorneys convinced her that her financial interests required immediate separation from her husband's legal and reputational problems. "Preston, the lawyers are telling me that your civil liability exposure could extend to our joint assets," Catherine explained during their final conversation. "I can't allow your mistakes to destroy our children's financial security." Preston found himself alone in his apartment on Wednesday evening, reviewing bank statements that showed the rapid evaporation of the wealth that had supported his entitled worldview for 45 years. His legal bills were already approaching 6 figures, and his attorneys had warned him that Maya Rodriguez's civil lawsuit could result in damages that extended well beyond his liquid assets. Preston poured himself a glass of wine that cost more than most people earned in a day, and realized that Maya Rodriguez had accomplished something that he had thought impossible. She had made him understand what it felt like to be powerless. For the first time in his adult life, Preston Whitmore couldn't solve his problems with money connections or inherited advantages. His racist assumptions had led him to attack someone who possessed more actual power than he had ever imagined possible, and she was using that power to teach him about consequences in the most precise and comprehensive way imaginable. Preston's phone rang. The caller ID showed his criminal defense attorney. "Preston, we need to discuss your plea options. The prosecutor is offering a plea agreement that would avoid jail time in exchange for a guilty plea to assault charges and completion of a court-supervised anti-bias education program." Preston understood that accepting the plea agreement would create a permanent criminal record that would make him unemployable in the financial industry. But going to trial risked conviction on more serious charges, including hate crime enhancements that carried significant prison sentences. "What do you recommend?" Preston asked. His attorney's response was brutally honest. "Preston, the video evidence is overwhelming, and the hate crime enhancements are supported by your recorded statements about racial advantages and quotas. A jury is going to see you as a privileged white man who attacked a successful black woman because you couldn't accept that she was more accomplished than you are." Preston closed his eyes and tried to imagine explaining to his children why their father was a convicted criminal who had lost their home, their lifestyle, and their financial security because he couldn't control his racism during an airport confrontation. "I'll take the plea," he said quietly. As Preston hung up the phone, he realized that Maya Rodriguez had taught him the most expensive lesson of his life. The difference between inherited privilege and earned power was that inherited privilege could be taken away by someone with actual competence and strategic vision. Preston Whitmore had been born into wealth and assumed that it made him superior to people who hadn't shared his advantages. Maya Rodriguez had built wealth through intelligence and hard work, and she was using it to demonstrate the consequences of attacking people based on racist assumptions rather than actual achievement. Preston had lost everything because he had underestimated the wrong person at exactly the wrong moment. And Maya Rodriguez was just getting started. While Preston Whitmore's professional and personal life collapsed in spectacular fashion, the Coastal Airways employees who had participated in Maya's discrimination were discovering that their careers had been just as thoroughly destroyed, albeit through different mechanisms. Jennifer Walsh received her termination notice on Thursday morning via certified mail. The notice cited violation of company anti-discrimination policies, failure to follow established customer service protocols, and conduct detrimental to company reputation and operations. Jennifer's termination was particularly significant because Coastal Airways had initially tried to minimize her role in the incident by placing her on administrative leave rather than acknowledging that her discriminatory assumptions had triggered the entire confrontation. But Maya's legal team had made it clear that any civil rights lawsuit against Coastal Airways would include Jennifer as a named defendant, and that her employment status would be used as evidence of the company's commitment to addressing institutional discrimination. Coastal Airways' legal counsel had advised immediate termination to demonstrate that the company took discrimination seriously and was willing to hold employees accountable for biased behavior. Jennifer's termination meant the loss of her pension benefits, her health insurance, and her professional reputation in the airline industry. At 48 years old, with 15 years of experience in airline customer service, Jennifer discovered that her employment prospects were effectively zero because the viral video footage had made her unemployable in any customer-facing position. Jennifer's husband called Maya's office and requested a meeting to discuss the possibility of a public apology that might mitigate the damage to Jennifer's career. Maya's assistant politely declined the meeting request and referred Jennifer's husband to Titan Capital Management's legal department, where he was informed that any public statements about the incident should be coordinated with Maya's attorneys to avoid additional legal complications. Carmen Valdez, the flight attendant who had witnessed the discrimination without intervening, faced a different but equally significant consequence. Carmen kept her job with Coastal Airways, but was required to complete 40 hours of anti-bias training and was transferred to domestic routes with lower pay and less prestigious assignments. More importantly, Carmen was promoted to a newly created position, Director of Customer Experience and Anti-Discrimination Training, Her responsibility was to develop and implement training programs that would prevent future incidents of discriminatory customer service. Carmen's promotion was Maya's idea, suggested through Monroe Industries' consultation with Coastal Airways about operational improvements. Maya had recognized that Carmen's internal conflict during the incident revealed someone with moral instincts who had been constrained by fear of company retaliation rather than personal bias. Carmen Valdez understood that what was happening was wrong. Maya explained to her legal team. She needs to be empowered to prevent similar situations, rather than punished for failing to stop something that her supervisors should have prevented. Carmen accepted her new position with gratitude and determination. She understood that Maya Rodriguez had given her an opportunity to transform her guilt about the incident into meaningful action that could protect future passengers from discrimination. Carmen's first initiative was a comprehensive review of Coastal Airways' customer service protocols, with particular attention to situations where passenger complaints might be influenced by unconscious bias rather than legitimate policy concerns. Her second initiative was the establishment of a confidential reporting system that would allow employees to document discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation from supervisors or colleagues. Carmen's work was revolutionary within the airline industry because it focused on prevention rather than reaction, and because it treated discrimination as an operational problem that could be solved through better policies and training rather than just a legal liability that needed to be managed. Maya monitored Carmen's progress through Monroe Industries' ongoing consultation with Coastal Airways about supplier relationships and operational improvements. She was pleased to see that Carmen was taking seriously the responsibility that came with her promotion. 6 months later, Carmen would be invited to speak at the International Aviation Customer Service Conference about innovative approaches to preventing discrimination in airline operations. Her presentation would be titled, "From Witness to Leader: How One Incident Changed Our Understanding of Customer Service Excellence." But the most significant personnel change at Coastal Airways was the resignation of Richard Hamilton as Chief Executive Officer. Hamilton announced his resignation on Friday morning, exactly 1 week after Maya's discrimination incident. His resignation letter cited personal responsibility for institutional failures that enabled discriminatory conduct and damaged company reputation. Hamilton's resignation was voluntary, but Maya's acquisition strategy had made his position untenable. Institutional shareholders had lost confidence in his leadership. Operational problems created by the Monroe Industries contract termination required management expertise that Hamilton didn't possess, and the ongoing threat of a hostile takeover made long-term planning impossible. Hamilton's replacement was Maria Santos, the former chief operating officer of Southwest Airlines, who had been recruited specifically because of her reputation for operational excellence and commitment to inclusive customer service. Santos's first action as CEO was to issue a public statement accepting full corporate responsibility for the discrimination that Maya had experienced and committing Coastal Airways to comprehensive reforms that would prevent similar incidents. Her second action was to contact Maya directly and request a meeting to discuss the possibility of restoring the business relationship between Coastal Airways and Monroe Industries under new management and improved policies. Maya agreed to the meeting but made it clear that any restoration of business relationships would require demonstration of genuine cultural change rather than just policy modifications. Ms. Santos, Maya said during their phone conversation, "Institutional problems require institutional solutions. I'm interested in seeing whether Coastal Airways can become a different kind of company under your leadership." Santos understood that Maya was offering Coastal Airways a path to redemption, but only if the company could prove that it had genuinely transformed its approach to customer service and employee accountability. The path forward would require more than apologies and training programs. It would require fundamental changes in how Coastal Airways operated and how its employees understood their responsibilities to passengers, regardless of race appearance or perceived economic status. Maya Rodriguez had just given Coastal Airways an opportunity to become the kind of company that could earn Monroe Industries' respect and business partnership. But she had also demonstrated that companies unwilling to address discrimination would face consequences far beyond legal liability or public relations problems. They would face financial warfare conducted by someone with the resources and strategic vision to win. The destruction of Preston Whitmore's career and the comprehensive response to Coastal Airways' institutional discrimination sent shockwaves through multiple industries, creating consequences that extended far beyond the immediate participants in Maya Rodriguez's airport confrontation. Within the private equity and hedge fund community, institutional investors began conducting comprehensive reviews of their relationships with fund managers who had histories of discriminatory behavior or controversial public statements. The speed and totality of Preston's professional collapse had demonstrated that reputational risks could translate into existential business threats more quickly than anyone had previously imagined. CalPER's decision to terminate their relationship with Whitmore Capital Strategies had triggered similar reviews at pension funds across the country. Investment committees that had previously considered discrimination complaints to be legal problems rather than business risks were now treating bias incidents as potential threats to investment returns and fiduciary responsibilities. Harvard Business School announced that they were developing a case study about Preston Whitmore's downfall for their executive education programs. The case study would examine how personal biases could create professional vulnerabilities and how reputation risk had become a critical factor in institutional investment decisions. Within the airline industry, Maya's strategic use of supplier relationships as leverage against discriminatory behavior had created unprecedented awareness of operational vulnerabilities that companies had never considered. Every major airline began reviewing their supplier contracts for business reputation clauses and other provisions that could be used against them if their customer service practices were challenged by powerful individuals or organizations. American Airlines announced a comprehensive review of their customer service protocols with particular attention to situations where passenger complaints might be influenced by unconscious bias. Their chief executive officer issued a public statement emphasizing that operational excellence requires treating every passenger with dignity and respect, regardless of appearance or perceived economic status. Delta Airlines established a new position, Vice President of Customer Experience and Inclusion, with responsibility for ensuring that customer service policies were applied consistently across all passenger demographics. Southwest Airlines, which had already established a reputation for inclusive customer service, used the Coastal Airways incident as an opportunity to publicize their own anti-discrimination training programs and their track record of promoting diversity in management positions. United Airlines faced particular scrutiny because of their own history of passenger removal incidents, including the viral video of Dr. David Dow being dragged off a flight in 2017. United's executives understood that they were vulnerable to similar supplier leverage if their customer service practices were challenged by someone with Maya's resources and strategic sophistication. The aviation parts manufacturing industry was also transformed by Maya's demonstration of how supplier relationships could be used as tools for social change. Monroe Industries received inquiries from civil rights organizations about developing supplier contracts that included anti-discrimination clauses as standard terms. Other aerospace manufacturers began incorporating similar language into their customer agreements, recognizing that business reputation clauses could provide powerful leverage for addressing discriminatory behavior. The International Association of Aerospace Manufacturers announced that they were developing industry-wide standards for supplier contract language that would address customer service practices and institutional discrimination. Boeing and Airbus both issued statements supporting the development of industry standards that would encourage ethical business practices and inclusive customer service among their airline customers. Wall Street's response to Maya's strategic campaign was particularly significant. Investment analysts began incorporating discrimination risk into their evaluations of airline stocks, recognizing that bias incidents could create operational vulnerabilities that affected financial performance. Goldman Sachs published a research report titled Reputational Risk in the Service Economy: How Social Media and Activist Investors Are Changing the Cost of Discrimination. The report highlighted Maya's strategic response as an example of how discrimination incidents could create existential threats to company operations and shareholder value. J.P. Morgan Chase announced that they were developing new criteria for evaluating the creditworthiness of service industry companies with particular attention to customer service policies and discrimination prevention measures. The legal community was equally transformed by Maya's comprehensive approach to addressing discrimination through business mechanisms rather than just litigation. The American Bar Association's Civil Rights section announced a conference on business strategy and civil rights enforcement, examining how economic leverage could be used to address institutional discrimination more effectively than traditional legal remedies. Law schools began developing courses that examined the intersection between business strategy and civil rights advocacy, using Maya's response to Coastal Airways as a case study in innovative approaches to social change. The NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund issued a statement praising Maya's strategic approach and announcing that they were developing resources to help other victims of discrimination understand how economic leverage could be used to address institutional bias. But perhaps the most significant response came from the business community's recognition that discrimination had become a material risk factor that could affect company valuations, operational capabilities, and competitive positioning. The Harvard Business Review published an article titled "The Maya Rodriguez Model: How Civil Rights Became a Business Strategy," examining how individual victims of discrimination could use economic leverage to create widespread institutional change. The article concluded that Maya's strategic response represented a new model for addressing discrimination that was more effective than traditional approaches because it created financial incentives for companies to prevent bias rather than just legal penalties for companies that allowed it to occur. Maya Rodriguez had just demonstrated that the cost of discrimination could be measured in billions of dollars rather than millions, and that the consequences could extend far beyond the individuals who participated in discriminatory behavior. She had made discrimination expensive in ways that the civil rights movement had never achieved through legal advocacy alone. And she was still not finished. 6 months after the incident at Gate A7, Maya Rodriguez stood in the boardroom of Monroe Industries headquarters, reviewing the final report on what had become known throughout the business world as the Dignity in Transit Initiative. The initiative had grown far beyond Maya's original response to her discrimination at Coastal Airways. What had begun as strategic leverage against a single airline had evolved into the most comprehensive effort to address discrimination in the transportation industry that had ever been implemented by private sector companies. Monroe Industries had partnered with civil rights organizations, industry associations, and federal agencies to develop new standards for supplier contracts that included measurable anti-discrimination requirements. The standards had been adopted by 67 aerospace manufacturers and had become the industry norm for business relationships with airlines, shipping companies, and other transportation providers. Under Maya's leadership, Monroe Industries had established the Transportation Justice Fund, a $50 million initiative that provided financial support for civil rights organizations working to address discrimination in travel and shipping. The fund also supported legal advocacy for individuals who experienced discrimination but lacked the resources to pursue comprehensive legal remedies. Carmen Valdez had become the national spokesperson for the initiative. Her transformation from conflicted witness to industry leader had inspired thousands of transportation workers to report discriminatory practices and advocate for policy changes within their companies. Carmen's training programs had been implemented at 43 airlines, and her confidential reporting approach had documented over 300 incidents of discriminatory customer service practices that had been addressed through policy changes and personnel accountability measures. Maya, I wanted you to see the latest numbers, Carmen said, handing over a comprehensive report on industry-wide changes that had resulted from the Dignity in Transit initiative. The statistics were remarkable. Discrimination complaints in the airline industry had decreased by 47% over the past 6 months, primarily because companies had implemented prevention measures rather than just reaction protocols. Customer satisfaction scores had increased across all demographic groups, but the improvements were most significant among passengers who had previously experienced discrimination or bias in airline customer service. Employee satisfaction had also increased, particularly among customer service workers, who reported feeling more confident about addressing discriminatory behavior when they witnessed it. The most important change, Carmen continued, is that employees are no longer afraid to speak up when they see discrimination happening. We've created approaches that protect people who do the right thing instead of punishing them for challenging authority. Maya nodded with satisfaction. The institutional changes were exactly what she had hoped to achieve through strategic pressure rather than just legal action. But the most significant transformation had occurred at Coastal Airways itself. Maria Santos had proven to be an exceptional CEO who understood that operational excellence required comprehensive attention to customer service equity. Under her leadership, Coastal Airways had implemented the most advanced anti-discrimination training programs in the airline industry. Every employee, from baggage handlers to pilots, completed 40 hours of bias recognition training annually. Customer service interactions were monitored by independent auditors who evaluated whether policies were being applied consistently across all passenger demographics. Coastal Airways had also established the industry's first customer dignity ombudsman, an independent advocate who investigated discrimination complaints and had authority to override company policies that created disparate treatment based on race, gender, age, or appearance. Most importantly, Coastal Airways had voluntarily agreed to make their discrimination prevention data publishing quarterly reports about customer service metrics, employee training outcomes, and bias incident resolution. The transparency had initially been risky because it exposed Coastal Airways to greater scrutiny than their competitors faced, but the risk had paid off through increased customer loyalty and positive media coverage that positioned the airline as an industry leader in inclusive customer service. Maya had been impressed enough by Santos's leadership to authorize Monroe Industries to resume business relationships with Coastal Airways under a new contract that included enhanced accountability measures and ongoing consultation about operational improvements. The renewed business relationship had been announced as a model for how companies could rebuild trust after institutional failures by demonstrating genuine commitment to change rather than just public relations gestures. But Maya's most innovative contribution to industry transformation had been the development of the Discrimination Impact Assessment, a standardized tool that companies could use to evaluate whether their policies created disparate treatment based on demographic characteristics. The assessment had been adopted by companies across multiple industries as a proactive measure for preventing discrimination rather than just addressing it after incidents occurred. Federal agencies had also embraced the assessment as a tool for regulatory compliance, and several states had incorporated it into their civil rights enforcement mechanisms. Maya's approach had demonstrated that business innovation could address social problems more effectively than traditional regulatory approaches, particularly when companies were given economic incentives to prevent discrimination rather than just legal penalties for allowing it to occur. The Harvard Business Review had published a follow-up article titled "The Economics of Equality: How Market Mechanisms Can Advance Civil Rights," examining how Maya's strategic approach had created financial incentives for companies to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination measures. The article concluded that Maya's model represented a breakthrough in civil rights advocacy because it aligned corporate profit motives with social justice outcomes rather than treating them as competing interests. Maya understood that institutional change required more than policy modifications or training programs. It required fundamental shifts in how companies understood the business value of treating all customers with dignity and respect. The Dignity in Transit initiative had created those fundamental shifts by demonstrating that discrimination was not just morally wrong but also operationally inefficient and financially costly. Companies that implemented comprehensive anti-discrimination measures experienced improved customer satisfaction, enhanced employee morale, reduced legal liability, and strengthened brand reputation. Companies that failed to address institutional bias faced supplier relationship challenges, increased regulatory scrutiny, consumer boycotts, and acquisition threats from activist investors. Maya had created a business environment where doing the right thing was also the profitable thing, and where discriminatory behavior carried economic consequences that extended far beyond legal penalties. The transformation had been comprehensive, lasting, and more effective than decades of traditional civil rights advocacy had achieved. Maya Rodriguez had proven that the most powerful tool for social change wasn't legislation or litigation. It was ownership. 2 years after the incident at Gate A7, Maya Rodriguez received an invitation that surprised her more than any business deal she had ever negotiated. The letter was handwritten on personal stationery, and the signature at the bottom belonged to Rebecca Thompson, the retired elementary school teacher from Minneapolis, who had witnessed Preston Whitmore's racist outburst. "Dear Miss Rodriguez," the letter began, "I hope you remember me as one of the passengers on Flight 447 who witnessed your humiliation and your grace under pressure. I wanted to invite you to speak at our annual Education for Justice gathering because your response to discrimination has inspired teachers across the country to think differently about how we prepare students for an inclusive society." Maya accepted the invitation and found herself 3 weeks later standing in front of an audience of 400 elementary school teachers discussing how her experience had shaped her understanding of the relationship between economic power and social justice. But the most meaningful conversation happened after the formal presentation, when Rebecca approached Maya privately to share how the airport incident had changed her own perspective on race and privilege. "Ms. Rodriguez, I need to be honest with you. Before that night at the airport, I thought racism was something that happened to other people in other places. I had never seen such blatant discrimination in person, and I had never watched someone respond to it with such strategic intelligence." Rebecca paused, clearly struggling with emotions that she was still processing 2 years later. "Watching you maintain your dignity while that man attacked you taught me something about courage that I had never understood before. But watching you turn that attack into widespread change for other people taught me something about power that I had never imagined possible." Maya listened with the attention she gave to all honest conversations about race and discrimination. She had learned that white people who acknowledged their previous ignorance about racism were often the most effective advocates for inclusive policies, once they understood the scope of the problems they had previously overlooked. "Rebecca, what changes have you made in your own life since that night?" Rebecca smiled with the expression of someone who had discovered a new sense of purpose. "I went back to school to get a master's degree in multicultural education. I've completely redesigned my curriculum to help children understand how bias affects people's opportunities and how they can recognize discrimination when they see it." She pulled out her phone and showed Maya photos from her classroom. "I teach third graders about civil rights history, but I also teach them about contemporary examples like your response to Coastal Airways. I want them to understand that fighting discrimination isn't just about protesting. It's also about building the kind of power that can create lasting change." Maya was impressed by Rebecca's commitment to translating her awakening about racism into practical educational changes that would affect hundreds of children over the course of her remaining teaching career. But Rebecca's story was only one of dozens of personal transformations that had resulted from the viral documentation of Maya's airport experience. David Kim had used his tech industry connections to develop an app called Witness that allowed people to document discrimination in real time and connect with legal advocacy organizations that could provide support and resources. The app had been downloaded over 2 million times and had been used to document thousands of discrimination incidents across multiple industries. More importantly, the app's data had been used by civil rights organizations to identify patterns of institutional bias that might not have been visible through individual complaint processes. David had left his corporate tech job to work full-time on expanding the Witness platform and developing additional tools that could help victims of discrimination access legal and financial resources. Maya, your example showed me that technology should be used to amplify justice rather than just convenience, David explained during a phone conversation about the app's impact. Watching you turn documentation of discrimination into institutional change inspired me to think about how digital tools could democratize access to the kind of strategic response that you were able to implement. Maria Santos, who had documented Maya's discrimination on her travel blog, had transformed her social media platform into a comprehensive resource for travelers who experienced bias in airlines, hotels, and other hospitality services. Maria's YouTube channel had grown to over 500,000 subscribers, and her documentation of discrimination incidents had led to policy changes at dozens of companies across the travel industry. But Maria's most significant contribution had been her work with the Transportation Security Administration to develop new training programs for airport security personnel who often made the same kinds of biased assumptions that had led to Maya's confrontation with Preston Whitmore. I realized that my role as a travel blogger gave me a responsibility to document problems but also to advocate for solutions, Maria explained. Your strategic response taught me that individual incidents of discrimination are symptoms of larger institutional problems that require comprehensive approaches rather than just case-by-case advocacy. Even Carmen Valdez had continued to build on her role as Director of Customer Experience and Anti-Discrimination Training at Coastal Airways. Carmen had been invited to speak at conferences across the aviation industry, and her training programs had been adopted as the industry standard for preventing discrimination in customer service interactions. But Carmen's most personally meaningful work had been her development of a mentorship program that paired young Latina women with successful professionals in the aviation industry. Maya, watching you respond to discrimination with strategic intelligence rather than just anger taught me that we can use our professional positions to lift other people up, rather than just protecting ourselves, Carmen said during one of their periodic conversations about industry improvements. I want young women who look like me to see that they can build careers in aviation and that they can use their positions to make the industry more inclusive for everyone. Maya understood that the most lasting impact of her airport experience wasn't the financial consequences for Preston Whitmore or the operational changes at Coastal Airways. The most lasting impact was the inspiration that dozens of people had drawn from her example of how to respond to discrimination with strategic thinking rather than just emotional reactions. People across the country were using her model to address bias in their own industries and communities, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the transportation sector where her original confrontation had occurred. Maya Rodriguez had demonstrated that individual experiences of discrimination could be transformed into widespread institutional change through strategic thinking, economic leverage, and commitment to creating opportunities for other people who faced similar challenges. But perhaps most importantly, she had shown that the most powerful response to hate was not more hate. It was the methodical construction of a world where hate was too expensive for people to afford. 3 years to the day after Preston Whitmore slapped Maya Rodriguez's phone out of her hand at gate A7, Maya found herself in the first-class cabin of Coastal Airways Flight 447, the same flight number where her discrimination had occurred, sitting in the same seat 1A, where she had been humiliated and assaulted. But everything else was different. The flight attendant who greeted her was a young black woman named Jasmine Williams, who had been hired as part of Coastal Airways' comprehensive diversity recruitment initiative and who had completed the most advanced anti-bias training program in the airline industry. "Good evening," Ms. Rodriguez Jasmine said with genuine warmth and professionalism. "Welcome aboard Flight 447. I want you to know that serving passengers with your level of integrity and commitment to justice is an honor for our entire crew." Maya smiled, remembering the fear and hostility that had characterized her interactions with Coastal Airways staff 3 years earlier. The transformation in company culture was visible in every interaction, from the boarding process that treated all passengers with equal respect, regardless of appearance, to the crew's obvious commitment to inclusive customer service. The passenger in seat 1B was a young Hispanic man who introduced himself as Dr. Miguel Santos, a pediatric surgeon who was traveling to Los Angeles to speak at a medical conference about healthcare equity. "Ms. Rodriguez, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but your response to what happened on this flight inspired me to become more vocal about discrimination in healthcare," Dr. Santos said. "Watching you turn a moment of humiliation into comprehensive industry change taught me that we can't just treat individual problems of bias. We have to address the underlying approaches that enable it." Maya appreciated Dr. Santos's recognition that her strategic response had implications beyond the aviation industry. She had received similar comments from people in education, healthcare, finance, and other sectors who had used her model to address institutional discrimination in their own professional environments. But the most meaningful moment came when Captain James Rodriguez, the same off-duty pilot who had witnessed Preston Whitmore's racist attack 3 years earlier, approached Maya's seat during the pre-flight preparation. "Ms. Rodriguez, I'm honored to be piloting your flight tonight," Captain Rodriguez said. "I wanted you to know that your example changed how I think about my responsibilities as a leader in the aviation industry." He paused, choosing his words carefully. 3 years ago, I witnessed injustice and felt helpless to stop it because I wasn't on duty and didn't have authority over the situation. But watching you turn that injustice into widespread change taught me that leadership isn't about having authority. It's about having courage to use whatever power you do have to make things better for other people." Captain Rodriguez continued, "I've spent the last 3 years working with pilot training programs to help other aviators understand how they can recognize and address discrimination in airline operations. We now have protocols that empower any crew member to intervene when they witness discriminatory behavior, regardless of their position in the company hierarchy." Maya felt a deep sense of satisfaction that extended far beyond personal vindication or financial success. The institutional changes that had resulted from her strategic response were creating opportunities for other people to be treated with dignity and respect, while also empowering aviation industry workers to prevent discrimination rather than just witnessing it helplessly. As Flight 447 prepared for takeoff, Maya reflected on the journey that had brought her from victim of discrimination to catalyst for industry-wide transformation. She had learned that the most powerful response to injustice wasn't anger or revenge. It was the patient construction of approaches that made injustice impossible to sustain. Preston Whitmore had attacked her because he assumed she was powerless. But Maya had spent her entire career building the kind of power that couldn't be taken away by someone else's assumptions or biases. She had used that power not just to seek justice for herself, but to create opportunities for other people who faced similar challenges. The young flight attendants who could now work in inclusive environments without fear of retaliation. The passengers who could travel with dignity regardless of their race or appearance. The industry workers who were empowered to speak up when they witnessed discrimination. All of them were beneficiaries of Maya's decision to respond to hatred with strategy rather than emotion. As Flight 447 lifted off from LaGuardia Airport, Maya opened her laptop and began reviewing the latest report from the Transportation Justice Fund. The initiative that had grown out of her airport discrimination was now funding civil rights advocacy in 12 different states and had helped thousands of people address bias in travel shipping and transportation services. But Maya's attention was focused on a new project: the expansion of discrimination impact assessments into the housing and healthcare industries, where bias in service delivery created life-threatening consequences for people who couldn't afford strategic responses like hers. Maya Rodriguez understood that her privilege came with responsibility. She had been able to respond to discrimination through economic leverage because she had spent decades building wealth and influence. But most victims of bias lacked the resources to purchase justice or transform entire industries. Her obligation was to use her success to create approaches that protected people who couldn't protect themselves. As Flight 447 reached cruising altitude and the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight flight to Los Angeles, Maya felt a profound sense of peace about the path that had brought her to this moment. 3 years ago, she had been humiliated and assaulted because of her race. Tonight, she was traveling on an airline that had become the industry standard for inclusive customer service, served by employees who understood that their professional success was connected to treating all passengers with equal dignity. Maya Rodriguez had kept the promise she had made to herself at 16 years old in that hotel lobby in La Jolla. Never again would she be in a position where someone could question whether she belonged somewhere because of how she looked. But more importantly, she had used her power to ensure that other people would also be protected from the kind of discrimination that had shaped her own journey to success. When they try to make you small, Maya thought as she closed her laptop and prepared to sleep, remember that you might just own the building they're standing in. But even if you don't own the building yet, you can always start building a better one. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about creating a world where revenge isn't necessary. Maya Rodriguez had built that world one strategic decision at a time, and she had proven that the most powerful weapon against hate isn't more hate. It's the quiet, methodical construction of love made manifest through approaches that protect everyone's dignity. The plane flew through the night carrying its passengers toward a future that was more just because one woman had refused to accept that discrimination was simply the cost of existing while black in America. She had made discrimination the cost of existing while cruel in America instead. And that had made all the difference. If this story moved you, please hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about standing up for what's right, even when the world tells you to sit down. Subscribe and ring that notification bell, because when we document injustice and hold people accountable, we change the world one story at a time. Drop a comment below if you've ever been underestimated or discriminated against. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And together we can make sure that dignity and respect aren't just privileges for some, but rights for everyone. Remember, true power isn't about shouting the loudest or making the biggest scene. True power is quiet, strategic, and changes everything without ever raising its voice. Stay strong, stay smart, and never forget that justice delayed is not justice denied when you have the tools to make it happen. See you in the next story.